Chapter 37.
Ragnarok. Roger that, Lunar Gate. Over and out. Sir, we have 3 capsules on approach. Shall we recover them?
Sitting at a control panel on the lunar base, one of the technicians churned.
Of course.
Standing behind him, a man crossed his arms in his spacesuit.
Did you think we were just going to let them float out there? Are these the special personnel coming aboard?
The second tech asked.
Yeah,
the spacesuit man nodded. It was awkward in his helmet. He actually almost only did that, forgetting his sun visor was down and they couldn't see his face through it.
Special packages from Odin. He forgot to ask their names, because of course he did. There's apparently a medical case on board though, so alert medbay. He also said one was a bit hostile with him. I hope they don't cause any problems. Shall we put troops on standby?
The second tech asked. The man thought for a moment, then shook his head, again forgetting they couldn't see him.
I have a feeling we won't need to. Then we'd better station then all the more. Hey!
The man in the suit glared as the first tech pressed the intercom button.
Capsule recovery team, initiate recovery process. Medbay, prepare for incoming patient, condition stable. Security, go to standby. Thanks for the vote of confidence,
he grumbled, turning from them.
Why do you always play me like that? You both suck. I'm gonna go check up on Adele. Take care of the rest, will you? I'll greet our guests when I get back.
The technicians shared a fond smile over the man as he walked away.
Yes, sir,
they echoed each other, laughing slightly. They didn't take any offense, nor did they fear for their job. For all that he was superior to them, they had never once seen, or even heard, of him abusing his power to punish in all the time they had known him. The recovery process was a thing of beauty. Practiced, smooth, and flawless. The pods were on perfect trajectory. The recovery team didn't even need to adjust as they pressed the release casters. Made of green lasers, a cross between light and magic, long rows of the nets burst into life. The pods, at escape velocity, slammed into them. The first 24 or so shattered easily under the force, as they were designed to do. Until, finally, close to the base but with plenty of nets left just in case, the pods caught and stayed. The recovery team was already moving in. All 3 pods caught on different net numbers, which was why they always accounted for more than they needed. As the laser grids collapsed back, the recovery team in their full spacesuits were grabbing onto them. The jet packs on their backs were used for corrections only to spare fuel. They didn't need much though. In space, they only needed to start moving and their momentum did the rest. Gently, with a great deal of expertise, the team moved all 3 pods into place, sliding them into the open hatches on the recovery bay. Squall was already starting to wake up. Cold sleep wasn't named because it was so warm and cozy. In his head, Shiva had begun combating the effects before they had even left the atmosphere. She didn't intend to, it was just her nature. She and Squall simply weren't affected by the cold the same way everyone else was. So he heard perfectly clearly when the technician called into their pods after docking.
Initiating quick thaw. It's gonna feel a bit itchy.
A bit? Squall felt like ants were crawling all over him as a strange electrical pulse traveled down his body, waking him from a sleep he hadn't fully gone into. Then the pods released and he was ejected down, sideways, into the docking chamber. Squall was instantly disoriented because his body could no longer tell up from down. Even worse than when he had been using float spells, because there just wasn't an up or down here. There was no real directionality.
That was unpleasant,
Quistis said dully, scratching at her arm as she came out of her pod.
You're telling me?
Squall rolled his shoulders. His eyes caught a flash of blue as Rinoa was pushed from her pod. She floated in the air, curled around herself helplessly.
Quick thaw complete,
the tech said over the intercom.
Locking onto rotation ring unit.
Squall and Quistis floated uselessly in the air as they heard something loud banging around outside of the dock. Squall tried for a moment to reach for Rinoa, but he had nothing to push off from and it wasn't like swimming at all. He couldn't move even a small distance.
Lock engaged. Generating artificial gravity. Nice and slow. Oh ow.
Almost immediately, the disorienting feeling of having no orientation went away as the machine kicked into life. Gently, the three of them floated down to the floor. Rinoa landed delicately on her side. Squall and Quistis touched down with their feet. Well, they were here. Squall let out a long breath, looking out of the high, thin windows. Into space, where the stars somehow looked brighter. The door out of the dock opened and a man in a white coat entered along with a security officer. The white-coated man stepped towards the two of them. Squall was already pulling out the official letter, an electronic file, from his coat pocket.
Here's the letter of introduction from Estar's ambassador,
Squall said, passing it to him. It was their right to be on this ship basically.
I'm Commander Squall Leonhardt of Balam Garden. This is Quistis Treep, one of my personal aides.
Quistis bowed her head to the man, accepting the title without comment. It sounded better and more official than my friend.
How do you do?
He nodded to both of them.
I'm Piet, head of the medical staff here. I was told there was someone needing attention. Wow.
Squall turned to see the security officer had walked over to Rinoa. He was leaning over her, grinning at her pretty face.
What is she? 17, 18? Is she dead? Don't touch her,
Squall growled darkly. The security guard jumped like he had been electrocuted. Squall gave him a withering glance as he approached. The guard backed away, his shaking hand going to his electric baton as Squall leaned over Rinoa's body and he pulled her up onto his back. As the officer was struggling to unholster the baton, Quistis touched his shoulder.
I wouldn't if I were you,
she whispered apologetically.
He didn't mean anything by it. It's been a stressful week for him is all. He doesn't mean to be rude. But, I'm afraid, I can't allow you to hurt him either. And this won't anyway. It will only make him mad.
Quistis smiled and touched the baton gently. The man blinked at her smile as she turned back to her commander, perfectly calm and composed.
I understand the situation,
Piet said, lowering his holoscreen where he had been reading the electronic letter.
Let's get her to the med lab and we'll talk there. Please, follow me.
Squall, carrying Rinoa, and Quistis followed Piet out. The security officer was left, standing holding his baton. When it suddenly started beeping. Jumping, he looked down and frowned because the display on the handle was telling him that the battery was dead. But he had just pulled it off the charger. The sick bay was surprisingly beautiful. The stasis room Piet had ready for Rinoa had a glass floor that looked out in the depths of space. She was surrounded by glass on all sides, so it was like she was floating in the heavens. The bed that Squall gently placed her on was a pod that closed around her and kept her vitals stable and her body warm. It was a much more elaborate setup than they had at the garden infirmary. Once she was secured, Squall stepped from her single-person room. The door shut and auto-locked behind him. More for his peace of mind than her safety.
"I've talked to my crew,"
Piet told him calmly.
"Everything will be all right with her. Come, let's go the control room. I believe the president is there and he'll want to speak with you first before you meet with Elon."
Piet led the way down the halls. There were bright glass walls everywhere, made of the same durable glass that had created the barrier hiding Esthar from the world. So it was a space station, but it was beautiful and filled with people going about their life like this was a normal office. The control room at the center of the base also had a window. Just at the moment, it was pointed towards the moon. The two technicians working at the control panel didn't even glance up as they came inside. Squall and Quistis had to stare for a moment. They had never seen the moon this close before and the effect was absolutely breathtaking. Piet frowned around, used to the view.
"I thought the president was here." "He was,"
one of the technicians said.
"He went out to check on Adele. He said he'll be back soon."
"I see." Piet frowned. Squall barely listened to the conversation. He was looking around at the technology. Meanwhile, Quistis was walking towards the window. Letting out a breath of amazement, she breathed.
"My goodness! Look at how close we are to the moon. Squall, do you see this? This is no time to be impressed,"
the controller she was standing beside told her, his voice dark with warning.
"Check out the monitor there." "This monitor?"
Quistis asked as Squall joined her at the console. The technician called up the first camera on the drone out watching the moon. From this spot, they didn't get a great look at it. But as he zoomed in with the droid, the two guests frowned, leaning in closer to try and figure out what they were seeing. On the pale moon surface, like a black smear, the large red mass that writhed around on the surface made them frown. The camera zoomed in once. Then again. They still couldn't quite see what it was specifically, but... The hell? Squall leaned back. That couldn't be what he thought it was.
"Monsters!"
Quistis breathed in fearful awe.
"The lunar world is a world of monsters,"
the tech nodded gravely.
"Didn't you learn that in school?"
"Of course," Quistis shook her head.
"But I didn't think that they all congregated like that." "Well, normally they don't. But as you can see, the monsters are gathering at one point. There's this weird, liquid stuff surrounding them too. We can't tell if they're excreting it or what. But they're all gathering into it. History's going to repeat itself. The lunar cry is starting." "Lunar cry?"
Quistis frowned at him.
"Oh. Sorry. You're not from Esthar, right? What do they call it outside?" "The cataclysm." "You don't mean the one that destroyed Centra, do you?"
Quistis paled. The man nodded, still frowning.
"Hence the reason we're so worried."
Squall turned from the console. It was disturbing, but not his problem. There was nothing he could do about it. The only thing he could do was the entire reason he had come here. Elon was somewhere on this station.
"Piet, where's Elon?"
He wasn't waiting for the president.
Oh, her room is up the stairs and down the hall in the presidential suite?
Quistis turned and rushed after Squall as he left the room. He walked quickly back into the hall and up the stairs set to the side. And another window. From this one though, he could see something strange floating out in space just beyond the lunar base. 2 technicians were standing there, looking out at it.
What is that?
Quistis asked them interestedly.
That's Adele's tomb,
the man said, pointing.
Adele's tomb?
Squall frowned, joining Quistis.
You don't mean... Sorceress Adele is there? Yeah, that's right. She's sealed in there. See those men going out? That's the president and his aides checking on the seal on her tomb. He frequently goes out to do it himself.
Quistis and Squall shared a look. Then Matron was right. Adele did exist somewhere. In space, yeah, but she was there. And she wasn't dead or her powers would have been passed on.
Where's the presidential suite?
Squall asked them. He felt suddenly like he needed to hurry.
Right there,
one of the men pointed to the door at the far end of the hall.
Thank you,
Quistis nodded to them. Squall was already walking in that direction. The door opened with a press of a button. Seated on a capsule that served as a bed, Elone turned as Squall walked quickly into her room. Surprise was replaced after a short moment by acceptance and a gentle smile. Squall stopped in front of her. He realized only now that it was the first time he had seen her since he remembered who he was. Who they all were. The recognition was visible in his eyes and Elone's smile widened as she looked at him.
Squall, I'm so happy to see you again.
Her words rang with double meaning.
Me, too,
Squall said and was surprised to find that it was true. Finally. After so many years. His sis was back again. Her face fell and she looked away.
I'm so sorry. I got you involved in so many things. It's my fault you've had so many hardships.
Squall shook his head, dismissing her apology as unneeded.
It's all right. I understand. I get what you were trying to do. Were we of any help? Of course.
Elone beamed back at him.
You were my eyes. Thanks to you guys, I was able to see how much I was loved. I couldn't change anything, but seeing it was more than enough. Thank you so much for that. It's okay,
Squall nodded.
I came here because I need your help. You said you can't change the past, right? You can find out things about the past that you never knew. And from what you've learned, you may see some things differently in the present. You're the one that changes. Not the past. Really?
Squall pressed urgently.
There's no way to change the past? At all? No, I want to find out myself. Elone, I need your power. I need you to take me to Rinoa's past. I need to see the past through Rinoa. I have to find out what happened to her. She's the only one who knows and she's trapped in a coma. I need to at least try to warn her.
Elone blinked in surprise.
You want to save her? You don't want to lose Rinoa?
Squall nodded. Elone looked down guiltily.
Squall, I can't. I don't know Rinoa. I told you, I can only send people I know in the present into people I knew in the past. That's the rules for my powers. I can't get around it. Believe me, I've tried. I brought Rinoa with me.
Squall pointed to the door.
She's resting in the med lab. Please, just come with me. Meet her.
Elo knew it wouldn't help. But she couldn't deny him this. She stood and followed him out of the room. She had some trouble keeping pace with him. She was the first person he slowed down for since he had found a method for waking Rinoa. In the silent medpod room, the green light indicating the life support system winked off. The cover folded back. Rinoa's eyes opened onto the stars. Squall was halfway down the steps. A red light suddenly burst into life. A loud ringing echoed through the halls as the three stopped in place, looking around.
What's going on?
Squall asked, his stomach sinking in dread.
Red alert!
One of the technicians called out over the loudspeaker.
Red alert! All units report to the med lab. Stat. Med lab.
Squall frowned, icy fear soaking into his veins.
Rinoa.
He turned to the girls.
I'll check it out. It doesn't look good. Elone, you had better go wait in the control room. Okay,
she nodded.
You be careful, all right.
Squall nodded as she started down the rest of the steps. He looked to Quistis.
Please, take care of Elone. I have to.
Quistis smiled gently.
I know. I've got this. Watch your back.
Squall didn't bother to run down the stairs. He vaulted over the rail completely, startling one of the girls running below. He landed, crouched, and was already sprinting down towards the med lab. His footsteps were echoing hollowly around him. Everyone had evacuated the area to get away from the red alert. Except for the security personnel. As Squall had, they were running to the trouble. Even as Squall was running up, the door on the med lab burst open. The security officer who flew out slammed his head against the far wall, knocking him immediately unconscious. Squall slid to a halt, his hand already reaching for the gun blade that wasn't at his hip. Slowly, moving so awkwardly it was a wonder she was staying upright, Rinoa came limping out of the med lab. Squall had to squint to look at her because it was like something was wrong. Like an aura he could barely see was surrounding her body, throwing off his eyes. As he watched, she turned and started down the hall. Her eyes were open, her body swaying so dangerously it looked like she might fall at any moment. But she didn't look at him, she didn't even glance his way. Her eyes were unfocused, far away. Rinoa. What happened to you?
Rinoa.
Squall ran for her. His hand reached out to grab her. He didn't even get to touch her skin. Crying out in pain, his body was sent flying. He almost didn't protect his head and neck in time as he slammed into the wall. His back spasmed and he gritted his teeth in pain. What was that? It almost felt like he had been electrocuted, yet not quite. Like the energy that had rushed into him wasn't even the same. Pushing himself up, he looked back at Rinoa. She hadn't moved very far ahead. She was walking like she had all the time in the world. Gritting his teeth, Squall ran to her again. His hand outstretched. If he could just grab hold of her. He slammed into the wall. Forced himself up and ran again. Cry. Slam. Again. Cry. Slam. Again. Eyes having trouble focusing, muscles shaking, Squall ran at her once more. His grasping fingers hit that weird aura and he felt that energy slam into him. He forced another step and just barely brushed the skin of her shoulder. Bam! Squall didn't protect his head that time. It slammed into the wall and he slumped down against it. Shiva was crying something he didn't understand, giving him a cura spell. Squall's vision went black but he didn't really go completely unconscious. After less than a minute, he was pushing himself up again. His body hurt like he had run full force into an electric fence. But something was wrong with Rinoa. Limping slightly himself, having trouble focusing his eyes, Squall ran down the hall after her. She was closing in on the control room now. More officers had tried to step into her path and had met the same fate he had. None of them were so lucky as to awaken from it as quickly. Though he was tempted to grab for her again, Squall did not. He walked just to the side of her, out of reach of that strange aura. She paid him no mind. More security officers came charging from the other side of the base.
"Stay back!"
Squall yelled at them, throwing out his hand. A few of them hesitated, one did not.
"I won't spare her just because she's your girlfriend."
The overeager guard was the same one Squall had threatened in the docking bay. Baton newly charged, he ran forward with a cry of anger.
"No! Stop!"
Too late. He hit her aura and was thrown not just back but up. He slammed into the high wall before crashing down to the floor. His arm was bent at an odd angle but he was unconscious and couldn't feel it.
"I'm not telling you to stay back for her safety. I'm saying it for yours!"
Squall yelled, frustrated. None of the other guards were attempting to come in closer after that though. Squall skirted around her, unable to do anything, as she walked into the control room. He tried giving her a cura spell. Tried one of Cepheus Yuna's spells. He even tossed a remedy at her in the hopes that maybe the cure-all for ailments would help. The liquid fizzled away before it even hit her skin. Rinoa continued, unabated into the control room.
"Rinoa!"
Quistis gasped. She could see she wasn't right. She put her hand on Elone, pushing her back against the wall. Rinoa wasn't interested in her. She continued on to the control panel.
"Stay back!"
Squall yelled at the technicians. They were loyal to their job. They jumped up to defend their place. These two didn't even have to touch her though. The aura reached out and took them out before they could come in close. Squall let out a breath of fear as Rinoa stopped in front of the console. One hand slowly came up and began typing gently on the buttons.
"Squall!"
Quistis looked at him, eyes wide.
"What's wrong with Rinoa?" "No."
Elone reached out for her under Quistis's arm.
"Squall, stop her!"
Next to Quistis, Piet was shaking his head.
"That's Adel's tomb seal deactivation device. You can't let her turn that." "Adel's tomb level 1 seal, deactivated. Adel's tomb level 1 seal, deactivated. Adel's tomb."
The electronic voice garbled and faded as Rinoa put her hand down on the panel. A small, localized spark of electricity shot out of her fingers and fried the panel.
"Stop her!"
Piet yelled. Crying out, Squall ran towards her again. He didn't grab with one hand. He grabbed with both arms. Trying to wrap around her. Almost as if he was planning on holding her. The power in the aura slammed into him painfully. He clenched his teeth as Shiva cried out, trying to help him absorb the shock. His muscles felt like they were being ripped apart. His bones felt like they were shattering in his body. Bam! Squall's body slid down the central console. Piet cried out, running to him. Rinoa turned and began walking out slowly.
Damn! Commander? Commander! Here!
Reaching into his lab coat, he pulled out something that looked like an Odin capsule. But smaller, about the size of a pinky nail. He closed it in his hand and touched Squall's shoulder. The healing energy that settled over his body was like a cool bath on a hot day. Shiva grabbed onto the energy gratefully, directing it to Squall's head where he had taken the most damage. Slowly, his eyes finally refocusing, Squall's lids fluttered back open. He groaned as he stood up, Piet helping him, still supplying the energy.
Take it easy, Commander.
Squall. Quistis turned from the large window, her face pale.
Come look at this. The moon's surface it's changing.
Thanking Piet with a nod, Squall walked over to Quistis's side. She pointed out to the moon's surface on the monitor. They could see it better now as the lunar base's orbit had brought it into better alignment. The large glob of monsters was gathered, focused. Honed into a single, enormous point on the moon. It was a perfect circle. Writhing. Menacing. Actually starting to come off of the moon as a large, pulsating mass of whatever it was.
It's overflowing with monsters.
Squall breathed in horror. They called it the lunar cry. The mental image that brought up was not promising. He really hoped he was wrong.
It's starting,
Piet said, shaking.
The lunar cry.
Squall guessed. Please say no. Please say no. Piet nodded once.
If the cry is happening, then we definitely must stop her. If that girl plans to free Adele, she'll have to go out there. The level 2 seal is located on Adele's tomb itself. If the cry occurs while she's out there. Which way?
Squall asked.
Up the stairs. The airlock is up there.
Squall nodded and sprinted past him. Pete's hands tightened together in worry. Quistis and Elone shared a look of concern and fear. Squall took the stairs two at a time. His eyes were scanning about for Rinoa, but she had made it quite a distance while he was being healed and watching the moon. As he was passing the long window, the tech standing there cried out.
Oh, Hein! Look! The moon!
Squall stopped in his tracks, looking out the window with her. The swelling was greater now. Nearly right beside the lunar base. Reaching out like an enormous finger towards Gaia. Squall's hands were shaking because he could only imagine the vast number of monster in there. The lunar cry. What Esther called the cataclysm that had destroyed Centra and filled the world with monsters. Almost every animal species had died off, including the lion Squall wore so proudly. Only a very select few that were strong enough to fight back, such as the chocobos, survived. The human populations too had been decimated. 80 years later, and history was about to repeat itself. As Squall stared, the protrusion expanded, tensed, pulsed. Then burst. Like a laser, the column of monsters shot out. Heading for Gaia. Squall's heart clenched as the enormous streak of red rushed towards them, blocking his vision of Te Moon. He could easily imagine what would happen next. "Please, be safe everyone."
"Tons of monsters,"
one of the technicians breathed, shaking.
I think they're heading for Esthar. They must be going for Tear's Point. Then, that means the lunatic Pandora is at Tear's Point."
The scientist beside him frowned at his friend. That name caught Squall's attention. That thing Laguna had been working on?
"When did this happen?"
the scientist cried, shaking his head.
"Hey,"
Squall interrupted them harshly.
"Have you seen a girl come by here? Probably walking funny." "Oh, yeah. She went into the locker room."
The tech nodded.
"But she better not be heading out there. And you shouldn't either if hey."
Squall ignored him and his warning. He ran into the room indicated. The door slid open obediently and Rinoa finally looked at him. Through the glass walls of the airlock and the colorless visor of the space suit she had donned.
"Rinoa."
The airlock beeped and the door behind her opened. Rinoa pushed out and floated into the outside of the pod docking bay. Cursing, Squall looked around desperately. He had to go after her. Which means he needed. In the second changing room he checked, Squall found a discarded spacesuit. One the recovery team had left there for refueling and cleaning. Squall didn't care. He grabbed it and hastily pulled it on over his clothes. It fit kind of awkwardly. It wasn't really in his size. But the airtight seal locked and the suit assured him on the heads-up display that it was ready for space. But it was low on oxygen and fuel. Squall ran into the airlock. It was painful waiting for the room to seal. Then for the air to be evacuated so the door could open. He didn't even wait for it to slid open all the way. Squall put his foot on the edge of the door and pushed out with all his might. There was no gravity here again. He was more prepared for it this time. Rinoa had a much greater head start on him. She was already moving towards the large bay doors at the far end. Squall hit the button for the boosters on his suit but he was out of fuel. This second-hand suit had already been drained, it wasn't ready for another walk. The doors were closed though. She couldn't get out. He had her trapped here. Almost as soon as the thought was finished, the bay doors opened. Of course. 3 men started floating in. All of them had their sun visors down to protect their eyes. The guy in the middle started in surprise to see Rinoa floating past him into the outside.
"Hey! What's this? Who was that?"
he asked the men beside him. The other guys were more focused on other things.
"The flood of monsters is drawing near Adel's tomb." "Adel's tomb? It's heading right for us. At this rate, the entire base is going to be destroyed. We have to announce an evacuation, sir."
Twisting in the air, freaking out slightly, the man in the middle cried loudly.
"Why is everything happening all at once? This is crazy. It's like someone planned the whole thing. Who set this up? Why did no one see this coming?"
Sorceress Ultimecia. Squall drew even with the 3 men. The aides had already lifted their visors and Squall had never drawn his down. They looked at each other in passing. The man in the middle stopped the hysterics as he looked at Squall. He had yet to lift his visor so Squall couldn't see who it was. He saw only his reflection in the glass. If the official symbol on his suit was any indication though, he would say he was looking at the president of SDR.
What? Who are you?
The man tilted his head curiously. Then they passed each other and Squall looked away. Rinoa was out now. If he wanted to catch up to her, he had to be quick.
Locking bay doors.
The computer announced.
All staff prepare for evacuation. No.
Squall reached out but he was too late. The bay doors slammed shut. His hands smacked against them, pointlessly punching at the wall. The suit took all of the force of the blows. Even if it hadn't, he couldn't punch through a metal wall. Crying out, Squall twisted like he was in a pool. He put his feet to the wall and jumped off. He couldn't get out here. He had to find another way. The float back was somehow even slower than the one to get here. The airlock was already open though, left waiting for him by the other guys. Squall landed within and the artificial gravity kicked on as the door sealed shut. Air was pumped in and Squall rushed out of the room. He hit the hall, looking left and right quickly. He needed another exit. He needed a way out.
It's much too dangerous here now, sir.
One of the aides to the president was saying. Squall looked over to see them pleading with their leader.
We must leave lunar base at once. We have to evacuate. Please, hurry to the pods, sir. Forget about me. Just go.
The man swept out his arm.
I'm gonna stay back and help the stragglers. I'm not leaving until I know everyone is off this ship.
The aides didn't even respond. They were well used to their president and they had their orders from the VP in such situations. Even if they hadn't, they would have reacted the same. Each man grabbed an arm and started forcibly carting the president away. Squall watched as the man cried out and struggled against them. They were strong though and they kept yanking. At one point, the man fell and landed on the ground, reaching out for Elon's room. The aides just took him by the legs and started pulling him that way, which, honestly, was easier.
Hey, you!
The president pointed at Squall authoritatively.
Take care of Elon. That's her room right there. She's a pretty girl with short hair and a sweet face. Don't you dare hit on her. Just get her off this thing and arg.
He reached the stairs and had to focus on not hitting his face onto the ground. Was that seriously SDR's president? Whatever, Squall had bigger problems. He ran down the hall, heading for the control room. He arrived just as the aides were forcing the protesting president down the lift to the escape pods. Piet, Elon, and Quistis were still standing around, freaking out. Piet was staring into space, eyes wide. Quistis had her arm around Elon, who was holding onto her like she might be the younger sister.
Damn it! The seal's gonna be broken.
Piet bemoaned as Squall joined him. Rinoa was out there now. He could see her just as he had seen the president before her. She was floating in front of Adele. Putting one hand on the tomb, she pushed herself down towards the control panel that the president had just been checking. It opened with a touch of her finger. She only needed to press a few buttons. The locks weren't even that specific because the hiding place had been so completely isolated. Cold sleep gas rushed out of the tomb as the seal deactivated and process began reversing. Rinoa pushed herself backwards and away. She was right on time. The monsters slammed into Adele's tomb, swallowing it whole. One of the monster's tails smacked into Rinoa and sent her flying back. Her limp body flew without even attempting to stop herself.
Rinoa!
Squall reached for her desperately, even knowing he couldn't touch her.
Come on!
Piet yelled, taking Squall's shoulder.
We have to evacuate. Now! They're heading this way. We'll be next. We can't leave Rinoa!
Quistis cried as Piet ran past her.
We have to do something.
Elone wasn't moving. Squall had to take her by the arm and pull her towards the evac lift. Elone was shaking her head even as he was pulling her aboard.
Squall, you should be protecting Rinoa, not me. You're the only thing on her mind right now. She's calling you. Can't you hear it?
He couldn't get it out of his head.
Elone, take me to Rinoa. Please.
He was begging now. He didn't care.
Last one!
Piet yelled as the lift landed.
Hurry!
He and Quistis were already running inside. Elone was shaking her head, frustrated tears in her eyes at her own limitations.
I don't know if I can send you. I don't know.
Squall chased after her into the evac pod. The wave of monsters landed on the Earth, darkening the sky. Spreading out over the planet. Widening from the force of the blow, spreading from the central point. The lunatic Pandora. Threads of light were already reaching upward as, twinkling like a star, Adele's tomb raced down. She had been protected by the very same sealing device meant to imprison her. She slammed into the top of the Pandora. The hard metal rippled like water as she passed through as the filaments of light caught her and pulled her down into the massive moon crystal pulsing just inside the monolith. Four individual stands. An escape pod made for four. Quistis and Piet were already in place. He was ready to hit the eject button. Elone was walking into her spot as the door sealed behind Squall. Helpless anger. Depthless despair. It was eating him alive inside knowing he was here and Rinoa was out there. In danger. Far from him.
Hein!
Screaming his pain, unable to think of anything else to do, Squall threw out his arms in desperation. The raw emotion plain on his face.
Rinoa is gonna die. I can't take it. Elone, please. I've never felt this way in my life.
He wouldn't survive it if she died. He just knew it. If she left him. If he was alone without her. Elone didn't say anything. She was shaking.
Take me to Rinoa.
Squall's voice was softer, but no less pained. Raw and tortured.
Take me to her past. Let me see.
Slowly, Elone nodded.
Okay. It may not work. But we'll try. Okay.
Squall let out a stuttered breath. It was the best he could ask for now. And not nearly enough.
Come on. We have to go now.
Piet yelled at them. Squall jumped into the fourth spot. The protective shields dropped down over their heads, locking them into place. Piet hit the ejection button. It wasn't a neat or easy blast off. But it was fast and immediate. The pod rocked as they were blasted into space. The automatic honing device would take them down to Esthar without any help from them, though it wouldn't be an easy trip. Elone's eyes were closed. Squall shut his as well. The high-pitched whistle started in his brain. For the first time, he welcomed it. And this trip wasn't nearly so jarring as any before it. The heat of the desert was beating down on them, even inside the jeep. The only way of cooling themselves they had was the tiny fan in the corner. Irvine, grinning without worry, was driving along calmly. He scratched at his temple only once, feeling a weird buzzing in his brain. He didn't think about it overly much. Growling in the seat beside him, Renoa's eyes were burning hatefully.
Irvine! Go back to D District! Right now!
Calmly, he shifted gears. Renoa was growling through his teeth. Finally, with supreme coolness, he answered simply.
Nope. I've got orders from your father. Don't call him that. I'm taking you straight back to Deling City. It wasn't easy pulling the strings to get you out, you know? You should probably be great FARGH.
Renoa's foot struck Irvine's face. He barely avoided running the car off the road. Jumping onto him, she ejected the Valkyrie from the blaster. Using it almost like a club, she started scratching at him violently without actually shooting it off.
ARGH!
Irvine cried out painfully, slamming his foot on the gas as he tried to protect his face from her onslaught.
Are you crazy? We have to go back and help everybody.
Renoa grabbed the emergency brake and jerked it up. The car was brought to an abrupt and sudden halt. The door automatically opened and Renoa jumped outside, landing neatly in the dirt. She turned as Irvine poked his aching head out. He had a host of new lacerations that were already no longer bleeding thanks to the brothers in his head. Brothers that Squall had helped him get, she would like to remind him.
They'll be fine,
he told her, annoyed.
They're seeds. I'm sure they can get out of there on their own whenever they very well please. You don't know for sure.
Renoa stomped her foot.
Squall might say, but no one has ordered me to escape, and end up staying in there.
Her Squall impression was terrible.
We can't have that. We have to go back and help them. And I don't care if I have to force you.
Glaring dangerously, passion lighting up her face, Renoa reached for him. Irvine opened his mouth to protest again. He didn't get a chance. Renoa slammed her hands down onto his head and jerked her knee up into his gut, crying out from the pain. Irvine doubled over just as she wanted. She forcibly folded him back into the jeep. Into the driver's seat. Though she would happily take over if she had to.
Ow! Ouch! Okay. Okay. Crazy woman! Get off me! I'm going!
Irvine slammed the emergency brake down, turned the car abruptly. Renoa was thrown back into her seat by the momentum. She nodded once, angry but satisfied.
You could have killed me,
Irvine growled at her.
You know this is stupid dangerous, right? You're about to try breaking into a prison. Full of guards. That's insane. I don't care.
Renoa glared at him, adjusting her Valkyrie back into the blaster.
We'll be careful, but we're saving them. Now punch it. Winterproofing.
Renoa blinked.
Yeah,
Quistis nodded, holding up the yards of fur and leather she had brought up from the laundry area on the B2 sublevel.
We're in Trabia territory now. It's only going to get colder. I want to have a special seminar on ice monsters, and part of that lesson is learning how to winterproof your clothing. It would be helpful for me to have some before and after shots. Well, I'd be happy to help, but I don't really know how to sew.
Frowning at the cloth, Rinoa gently closed the book she had picked out from the library and brought out here to the courtyard around the infirmary. Angelo liked it here, and so she spent a great deal of time reading in the area. At least, time when she wasn't reading with Squall in the library.
It's okay. We'll teach you. We. Yeah.
Quistis tossed back her hair with a flick of her head, trying to dislodge the funny buzzing in her brain. She couldn't do it with her hands, loaded down as they were.
Selfie is going to be joining us. I asked Sue, but she's working with Squall this afternoon on seat exam plans. Well, okay.
Laughing, Rinoa stood, dusting off her clothes. She turned to her dog.
Angelo, you stay here and play, okay? I'll be back later.
Her dog sort of coughed, snuggling in deeper against the emerald grass he so loved against his fur. It was so cute to see. It made Rinoa wish she had a camera.
Come on. We're doing it in my room. It's not very big since I live in the dorms again, but it should be sufficient for the three of us. I'm sure it will be fine,
Rinoa smiled, falling into step beside her. The two were quiet as Quistis led the way. If Rinoa noticed any tension about the other girl's shoulders, she didn't remark upon it. Of course she felt no tension. Rinoa had been nice to her since they got back. It was like she had completely forgotten. But Quistis hadn't. She wanted to say this before they met up with Selfie. To finally get it out.
I'm sorry. Hey.
Unprepared for the sudden apology, Rinoa started.
What? Why? I'm sorry. For what I said. Back in Delling City. What are you? Oh. You mean? Oh.
Rinoa trailed off, looking away. Honestly, things had gotten so crazy afterwards that she hadn't paid a bit of attention to it.
I'm sorry. For what I said. For how I said it. I had no right to. What I mean? I was jealous. I was stupid jealous. And I let that affect me when you were only trying to help. Even if you were wrong, I had no right to snap at you the way I did.
Smiling, Rinoa reached out and touched Quistis's shoulder.
Hey, don't worry about it. We all say things when we're mad that we don't mean. You should have heard the things I said to Squall when we first met. We're friends now though, right?
Quistis beamed.
Of course we are.
Rinoa smiled.
Hey, I was thinking about my float spells. I can't really use them. I've practiced and I still suck. You want to take them off my hands?
Quistis laughed. Grateful at the quick forgiveness and change of subject.
Sure. I'd love them. Underwear.
Selfie blinked, confused. There was a cookie hanging out of her mouth as she stood on her bed, trying to tack a YRP concert poster onto the wall.
Yeah.
Rinoa shifted nervously in her doorway.
You know, like pretty undies. Maybe you should, like, close the door. Yeah. Right.
Stepping in quickly, Rinoa hit the button to slide the door closed. She smiled at Selfie sheepishly as she jumped from her bed, taking a bite of the cookie on the way. Rinoa was pretty sure she had stolen it from Zell's secret stash.
So, where is this coming from?
Selfie asked, grinning.
Are you in Squall? No. Hein, no.
Rinoa was practically glowing red. Selfie doubled over, laughing uproariously.
But you're thinking about it. Ugh. I knew I was going to regret bringing this up to you. But your body type is closest to mine. And you're the most adventurous. I figured you would be most likely to have something. Well, yeah, we're close, but we're a little too different. You're a minus in the boob compartment compared to me. Hips too, now that I look at it. You're kind of lean. You've lost weight since you started hanging with us. Maybe you could have fit back then, but definitely not now. You think I've lost weight?
Rinoa cried worriedly, grabbing for her own body.
Relax.
Selfie laughed, scratching at her head, trying to dislodge that weird feeling that started like a buzzing.
You're getting more athletic. Squall will dig that, I promise. And how do you know that?
Rinoa asked sharply, eyes narrowing suspiciously.
I said, relax. He's so not my type. He's practically my brother, for crying out loud. You know that Irvine would be your brother using that same logic, right? Hush. No one asked for your hocus-pocus logic. Rinoa, honestly, I wouldn't worry about it. But...
She frowned, looking down at her body that she suddenly felt so self-conscious about. Squall really liked her breasts. If they were shrinking as she lost weight, wouldn't he be unhappy?
Stop worrying. Squall definitely doesn't care about your undies. I care about my undies. I regret having this conversation with you. Just pretend it never happened. I'm leaving now. Just so you know, the undies would be removed for what you're thinking about doing anyway.
Selfie laughed loudly as Rinoa slammed the door shut behind her, deliberately cutting off this conversation before it got any more embarrassing.
Squall's ring.
Zell tilted his head curiously.
I don't know where he bought it. I don't think Balam's jewelry store sells that stuff. He might have bought it from like a catalog or something.
Sunlight glinted down from above, reflecting off of the glasses in the cafeteria. They were clinking together gently as the garden moved along. No one paid it any mind though. They were all used to everything rocking just slightly since the garden started moving.
I really want the same one,
Rinoa smiled a bit shyly, playing with her fingers.
It looks really cool, doesn't it?
Zell tilted his head back, scratching at his ear. It was kind of buzzing a bit.
You mean that one with the weird monsters carved on it? Yeah. That's the one.
Rinoa beamed brightly.
Well, alright,
Zell laughed, getting caught up in her enthusiasm.
How's about I make you one? I'm pretty good at that kind of stuff. Really?
Rinoa laughed.
I mean, I know you're good at sewing, but smelting too. Yeah, totally. I'm 100% self-sufficient, baby. I can make my own gloves from the hide to the metal plates. A ring shouldn't be a problem. Well, then, sure. Okay.
Rinoa laughed excitedly.
Let's go have Squall show us the original. I'll need to make a mold of it and stuff.
Suddenly, Rinoa blushed red. She looked down shyly, crossing her arms in front of her.
We can't do that. Hey? Why not? It's embarrassing. Say what?
Zell made a face, staring at her in confusion. Realization came on slowly. Zell's back stiffened as he finally noticed what everyone in the garden had already accepted as normal.
Oh. No.
Rinoa said quickly, face glowing bright red.
It's not what you think.
Except it was exactly what he thought. Zell could see that when she turned, face still bright red and her heart pumping so fast Zell could see it in her neck. Squall came back to reality easily. He was already shaking his head, trying not to let it affect him at how good it was to hear Rinoa's voice, even echoed from the past.
Elon, that wasn't it. That was too far back. It was only about a week ago. I'm sorry,
she said gently, her voice soft.
Let me try again.
Hey? Where am I? Bright white light seen through closed lids. Lids that opened partially, slowly, and stared up at the ceiling of Galbadia Gardens auditorium. You're. Gentle footsteps to his left drew his attention. Rinoa's body dropped down onto her knees beside him and Cypher looked up into her strangely blank eyes. His body hurt. His head was buzzing annoyingly. It was far too bright in here. He was shamed. Rinoa reached out gently and pulled him into her arms. Her touch was gentle, almost loving, as she stroked him to full consciousness. Rinoa. She smiled gently but it didn't reach her eyes. There was a deep darkness there, yet somehow strangely dead and dull. And looking at her hurt in a weird way. Like his eyes were trying to focus on two things at once. This isn't Rinoa.
Oh, my loyal knight, Cypher,
she said sweetly, hollowly, to him. Her voice had that same empty, ringing tone that so haunted Squall's dreams.
Your sorceress is alive. Your sorceress demands.
Ultimecia. The future sorceress is inside Rinoa. She flickered in his vision. Like a channel picking up two images. He could see Rinoa, but superimposed over her features was another face. One he couldn't quite focus on. Transferred. From Edia. Where's Rinoa?
Find the legendary lunatic Pandora, said to be hidden beneath the ocean. Bring it to Esdar. To a place called Tare's Point. Only then shall the sorceress provide you with dreams again.
Rinoa. Where are you? She leaned over him, pressing her lips to his. At her touch, all the injuries weighing Cypher down were blown away. Gone. Like they had never been. Cypher's eyes opened fully as the pain vanished in the wake of her power. Cypher grinned as he pushed himself back up. Rinoa. Answer me. Please. I can't help you if you don't answer me.
As you wish, Ultimecia,
Cypher replied eagerly, walking away from Rinoa. Leaving her behind without so much as glancing in her direction. Rinoa. Squall. I'm scared. Rinoa. I hear you. I can hear you. Who's there? Get out.
Rinoa.
Squall's heart was racing. His breathing erratic. That presence. That dark, hate-filled spirit. washing over him, shocking him with an energy that wasn't quite electric. He knew who that was. He had never met her, but he knew her. A loud thud had his eyes focusing back on the present. To Elone, who had fallen from her safety lock in the pod and collapsed down onto the ground. Of course. She had been in there with him. She had felt that evil witch just as strongly, if not worse. Squall hit the release on his safety bar. It swung up over his head and he stepped out quickly, dropping down to his knee and reaching for Elone. She was already turning to look at him. Though she was breathing hard, she was more shocked than anything. But she was more concerned about him.
Did you get to find out what happened to Rinoa? Were you able to change the past?
Squall shook his head, his jaw clenching tightly.
It's like you said. I couldn't do anything. What should I do?
He turned to her, desperate at this point. He would do anything. Give anything.
I remember those eyes.
Elone smiled sadly, reaching up for him. She couldn't touch him inside his helmet, but she could and did cradle the glass.
You just looked at me with the same eyes you had when you were little. Those curious, innocent, puppy dog eyes. I loved those eyes. My sweet little Squall. That's in the past,
he said, his voice rough.
That's right. What's important, what really matters, is right now. I think. I finally see that. The past. It's past. And, yeah, some of it was bad. But it is. And we can't change it. What we can change is now. Right now. I have to help Rinoa now. That's the only thing I can do, right? Please? Sis. Nothing else matters to me. Not the past. Not the future. Just this.
Yes, Elone smiled at him, her eyes swimming with tears and emotions. The very same eyes she had looked at him with that first day in the infirmary, so long ago now. Seeing the adopted little brother she thought she had lost once again. Reaching out, Elone took his hand in hers. Taking a breath, she nodded.
I'm ready. I can do it now. I can send you to her. You said it was impossible. What I said was that I can only send you into people I know. I know her now, Squall. I've seen her through everyone's eyes. Her passion. Her dedication. Her nerves, fear, and courage. I've seen who is she in the past. I know who she is now. Talk to her, Squall. Your voice may not reach her, but your heart will.
Our hearts. Rinoa, can you feel me in your heart?
Are you ready? I'm taking you to the nearest past. To the closest present to the future. Remaining life support system, 15 seconds.
15 seconds. Was that it? Of course, the suit hadn't been fully fueled, the tanks more than half empty, when she had put it on, but still. 15 seconds. Could she? Could she still make it? How? She couldn't do anything. Drifting. Endlessly. Helpless. She was completely helpless. Unable to do anything more but watch the pinpoint stars in the endless sky twisting around the glass in her helmet. Endless.
Remaining life support, 0 seconds.
No. There was an end. Rinoa's body trembled against the truth of it. Against the reality she couldn't accept. Because in her life she had never come this close to the edge before. This was it. I'm gonna die.
Life support has terminated.
It was hot in the spacesuit. The air had stopped flowing. Her own breath was starting to fill it up in its place, slowly suffocating her. She was going to die out here. Alone. Goodbye. Squall. Rinoa. No. Don't give up. Hey? What was that? In her ears. Like a buzzing. Can you hear me? It's Squall. Rinoa. Rinoa. It was getting warmer. The oxygen was getting thinner. Instead of feeling panicked, Rinoa found herself actually calming down. Getting drowsy. Slipping away. Rinoa, come on. Remember what you said. Our hearts will always be together so long as we think about each other. Rinoa, I'm right here with you. Listen to me. Clink. It was such a small sound. Almost insignificant. And yet, Rinoa found her eyes opening again to trace its location. Right there in her field of vision. Lifted by the lack of gravity. Her mother's wedding ring, bouncing softly against Squall's lion ring. The lion. Proud and strong. Like him. The buzzing in her head was that much stronger. No. Not a buzzing. It was words. Half heard and distant. But growing stronger the longer she focused on them. She could hear his voice. His ring. His heart. She was still alive. She could hear him. Squall. There's an emergency air supply on your suit. Activate it. Her fingers reached for the control panel on her chest. She didn't know what button it was. She just pressed one. Letting him decide which. So long as she didn't think about it, it was easy for her to tell which way he wanted her to go. Under a hood placed over it for protection. She pulled down on a latch, ejecting it into space. Revealing the square, blinking red button underneath. It depressed easily under her fingers. A burst of air, cool and invigorating, rushed into her helmet, upsetting her hair and releasing her tears from her eyes. Rinoa was crying now, the droplets floating around her head, as she took in deep, grateful breaths.
Emergency life support, engaged. Time remaining, 15 minutes.
15 seconds. To 15 minutes. That's it. Just wait for me. I'm coming. Hold on for me. Squall's eyes snapped open again, breathing fast in relief. Elone was beaming at him, tears of joy falling down her face. Squall nodded to her once, standing up.
I'm gonna go find Rinoa.
Elone sat back, still smiling in understanding.
You didn't need my help at all. Your hearts are already connected. She can still hear you. I can hear her, too. Thanks, sis.
Squall walked past her, grabbing for the handle on the wall. Piet and Quistis gasped as he pressed the up button, sending it gliding on its tracks towards the airlock.
Wait!
Quistis yelled at him desperately.
Come back! You can't go out there! Squall! Idiot!
Piet shook his head, his mouth open in horror.
There's no way he can get back. He's insane. He's gonna run out of fuel and life support in no time. They're both gonna die.
Maybe. Squall didn't much care in that moment. The handle stopped before the first door of the airlock. It opened with the press of a button and Squall continued up. The glass shut and there was a loud rushing of gas as the airlock emptied. Then the outer doors opened. Squall didn't think twice. He launched himself with his hand, kicking off with his feet. Leaving any promise of safety behind, he threw himself into space after her.
Rinoa! Where are you?
He could still feel her there. Not quite like a buzzing in his brain. More like a pull in his chest. A magic he didn't understand pointing him in the right direction.
I'm gonna find you, no matter what,
he promised, pressing the button for his jetpack. He only had a little fuel. He would need to be sparring. He didn't need to see her. He could feel her. He heard her in his head. Not quite like a voice. Almost like a GF. Feelings and thoughts that almost functioned as words. A little weak, but growing steadily stronger the longer he focused on the sensation. Squall had his direction. He pressed the booster button, rocketing him forward after her. The heads-up display told him he only had about 10 seconds worth of rocket fuel remaining. At 5 he stopped, allowing his own momentum to carry him. He saw her then. A white dot amongst the other white dots. Twirling aimlessly. Unable to stop herself from moving, but still not moving nearly as fast as himself. He used the remaining 5 seconds to chase after her. He only needed to grab her arm. Her leg. Any piece of her really. Somehow though, he ended grabbing her about the waist. His body curved naturally, falling into line with hers. There was no warmth to share between the suits, but she was there. Her body moved at feeling his arms wrap around her. She didn't need to see him to know who it was. Covering his hands with her own, she had to resist the urge to weep harder.
Squall! Thank you! I heard your voice.
She was alive. She was awake. He could hear her voice. He had to see her face. Taking her by the shoulder, Squall twisted her around in his arms. She turned readily. His heart clenched painfully as he finally, after an eternity, saw her beautiful eyes looking at him again. Those eyes he had lost himself to. That smile he sought with the determination of a dying man to water. There were roses in her cheeks, tears in her eyes. She was alive.
I can't believe it!
He whispered, holding her as close as the spacesuits would allow.
Are we gonna make it?
She whispered back to him. There was no sound system here. No air to carry the sound between them. She was talking and he just heard her. He accepted it just like that.
Don't worry about it,
Squall told her calmly. What he hoped was calmly. Don't worry about it. They were out in the middle of space. The moon was pouring monsters onto Gaia like a water hose. They were out of fuel. Running on emergency oxygen. What now? Die in space? Was that not reason to worry? Squall felt so helpless again. He had her in his arms once more, but for how much longer? 10 minutes? It was all the oxygen they had left. He couldn't even save Rinoa. Come on, think. There had to be something that he could do for her. Squall. He blinked, turning and following her gaze. Ejected from the lunar cry, floating as aimlessly as the two of them, an enormous red ship was twisting in space. Nearing them. Close enough that Squall might be able to touch it. He clenched his jaw. Okay. Another goal. He could do this.
Rinoa, is Diablos still in there?
He hadn't been pulled out before she went unconscious and no one had wanted to draw him out forcefully.
Yeah, he is. Why? Diablos, Master of Gravity, pull us closer to that ship. I need to get us in there.
Everything produced a gravitational field. It was a fundamental force of nature. From the smallest dust particle to the most massive star in the cosmos. It was usually only noticed on the large scale because of how weak gravitational forces were around small objects. On Gaia, in competing with the planet's pull, Diablos was limited in some ways. Out here, in the weightlessness of orbit, he had a far greater command of the weaker forces that he had always had control of. As the big red ship began coming in closer, star painted in white on its side, he manipulated those fields so they were drawn towards it much faster. Squall reached out as it rotated past them, grabbing onto the hull with the grippers built into the gloves of the suit. Their bodies jerked slightly as they suddenly hooked onto the ship's momentum and began twisting with the ship.
Rinoa, I saw an access hatch on the body, right over there. I'm going to move us that way. I need you to get it open while I hold on. K.
She was tucked into his side. She had her hand around his waist, he had his arm about her shoulders. They were holding on to each other for dear life. Squall wasn't going to let her go, not even for a moment out here, so he had to scoot one-handed around to the hatch. It was above the airlock, made for people to enter and exit from here. It opened readily when Rinoa grabbed onto the silver handle on one corner and twisted it. It dropped down, sliding open.
Diablos, pull us inside. He said ask nicely,
Rinoa snickered.
Diablos, pull us inside or I'm shooting you at the moon. He said you're an ass.
Laughing, Rinoa felt Diablos manipulating their gravity again, so they floated out over the hatch, then down. He pulled them to the floor, enabling them to walk almost normally. Not quite, but it was better than flying off into space again. Squall sort of. Hop/walked to the control panel inside the airlock. He pressed the button to seal the top shut again and Rinoa watched as the outside was cut off, leaving them inside. She let out a stuttered breath as Squall typed on the panel.
There's still power. About 3/4 capacity. And there's air. About half a tank. The readout says that should be enough for about 15 hours. I don't know what it's basing that estimate on, but it's better than the suits. Come on. I see the crew cabin through these doors.
Rinoa turned and quickly jogged/hopped after him. She laughed because it was so awkward to do so. She really wasn't any better at this than she had been at controlling the float spell. Squall turned and saw her struggling. He looked back at the panel and reached out. About a minute later, he figured out how to turn on the artificial gravity. The two of them sank down to the ground, their bodies orienting themselves eagerly.
Okay.
He looked back at her. Rinoa smiled and he nodded, leading her into the crew rooms immediately next door. He was already pressing the release on his spacesuit helmet. He jerked it off his head gratefully, tossing it onto one of the empty crew beds. Behind him, he heard Rinoa moving similarly. The two of them quickly pulled off the depleted suits, tossing them carelessly onto one of the beds. No longer weighed down by the bulky outfit, Squall walked quickly over to the far panel in this room. Rinoa was slowly smoothing out the duster that had been all bunched up in the suit. Frowning.
The door is unlocked,
Squall said, nodding.
Okay. We'll make our way up to...
Sniff. 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 He turned quickly to see Rinoa quickly trying to wipe tears from her face.
What's wrong? Are you hurt?
Squall walked quickly back towards her. Rinoa shook her head as she dropped down onto the low cot built into the wall. She was trying to keep more tears from falling but it wasn't working. Squall kneeled down in front of her, frowning as he tried to interpret her facial expression. Because those didn't look like tears of relief.
Rinoa, what is it?
He asked softly.
Squall. What have I done?
He blinked at her.
Oh, Hein.
She grabbed her stomach, doubling over as the weight of her actions pressed down on her forcefully now that she was out of immediate danger. Shit.
Hey. Hey. Listen to me.
Squall grabbed her arms and forced her to turn her head up to him.
Don't think about it.
But...
No. We have enough problems right now. Anything happening outside of these walls is beyond us. We can't do anything about it, so do not even think about it. Focus on this. Right now.
Rinoa sniffed again, but her tears were slowing.
Block out everything else, Rinoa. Those are problems we cannot solve. So anything that happened before, anything that might happen next, put it away. Right now we need to get to the cockpit. If there's power and oxygen, there might still be fuel. So we have a chance to get back. We can go home? Back to garden.
Squall nodded, standing. He didn't remove his hands from her. He just trailed them down her arms, lifting them with him so he was left holding her hands.
I don't know how to fly a spaceship, but if there was ever a time to learn. Seeds do need various skills.
Rinoa chuckled, smiling at him. He nodded.
I'll figure it out. I don't really have a choice. We only have 15 hours worth of oxygen. But if I can build that from 15 seconds, I can get us home no problem. 15 seconds to 15 hours. Not a bad turnaround at all.
Rinoa got to her feet as well. She really loved the simple way he looked at everything. Put it all away. There was nothing else right now. She could do that. She dearly wanted to do that. And if that meant running from all the truths she wasn't ready to face, then that was fine with her. Squall nodded and turned to walk back to the door panel. The crew cabin doors had to be opened manually for the privacy of the crew. As his finger moved over the button.
Thank you, Squall.
He turned back to see Rinoa looking at the floor, a slight blush on her cheeks. Her hands were clasped behind her back. She looked adorable. Damn, it was good to have her alive once more.
You rescued me again. I can't thank you enough. I owe you so much. Ah. Don't worry about it.
Squall averted his eyes awkwardly. Why was this awkward? Why was he suddenly feeling so nervous?
Just happened to find me at everyone else's insistence again.
She guessed, eyes dancing. She was giving him a way out. A way to avoid feelings that she knew he had problems with. She understood and respected him enough to do that for him. He could face those feelings for her.
No, I wanted to do it. I did exactly what I wanted to do.
The smile was slow to break out on her face as his words registered in her mind. Chuckling happily, Rinoa held out her arms. She looked at him expectantly. Squall blinked, unsure what he was looking at.
The spacesuit was in our way before,
she explained, her eyes inviting. He didn't understand. Why was Shiva laughing?
Give me a hug,
Rinoa giggled along with her. Oh. Was that what that was? Squall couldn't say he had ever seen anyone ask him for one before. He didn't even recognize the gesture.
A real tight one.
Rinoa threw her arms about herself to demonstrate.
I need to know that I'm alive.
Yeah. He could have her, conscious, in his embrace. Just what he wanted. What he was aching to have at this moment. Because he wanted to prove to himself that she was alive as well. To squeeze her so hard that his arms went numb. To breathe in her scent. To have her heart beating, vital and true in his ears once more. But he knew better. Once he started, he wasn't going to want to stop. And he wasn't going to be happy with a short, abbreviated show of affection. He was going to hold on for a while. They didn't have that luxury right now. They were alive, he knew that intellectually. And that would have to be enough. They still had to get back before their clock ran out.
We may be alive right now, but look at our situation.
Rinoa frowned, her arms falling. She actually looked around though. Reminding herself where she was and that this was only a temporary reprieve.
You want to live, right? You want to go back and see everyone, right? And not become other people's memories.
Her voice was sad, but strong.
That's right,
Squall nodded.
Let's get to the cockpit, and once we're back on Gaia Isle.
His voice trailed off. He wasn't quite ready to say it yet. But that was enough. Rinoa understood and she nodded, smiling at him.
My life is in your hands, Commander. I trust you.
Squall could feel it. The absolute and complete faith she placed in him. It was humbling even as it made him feel that much stronger. Like he could push this ship back towards Gaia by hand, that was what it took to keep her safe. Giggling at the ferocity of his emotions, Rinoa followed him from the cabin. They found themselves walking across a short bridge over a large holding area below. There was a door on the other side, stairs leading down. Squall was already moving towards the door. The loud shriek that echoed from below almost sounded like cloth shredding through metal. Squall turned quickly as Rinoa jumped.
What they?
They shared a look. Squall walked to the rail and leaned over curiously. He heard something moving down there. Something big. Something ugly. Squall drew back in disgust at the thing that walked into view. It had 2 legs that ended almost like a tripod with splayed toes. Arms longer than its body tipped with wicked claws. Its thick purple skin was heavily wrinkled and looked strange, almost like it was scarred. It moved awkwardly, slowly. The head was tiny with glass-like pink eyes, 4 of them, on the slender head. But it had some kind of weird, large jaw protruding from its abdomen with needle-like teeth handing down. At least, he thought it was a jaw. It was such a strange configuration of wrong body parts that he couldn't even tell if it was shelled or wearing weird armor. Rinoa caught a glimpse of it and her cry of horror was cut off by her own hands slapping over her mouth. Too late. The beast heard her and turned. It was fast. Squall and Rinoa both dropped down to a crouch behind the railing. "What is that?" he could hear her asking in his head. Squall shook his head, saying he didn't know in return.
"Doesn't look like a very friendly creature,"
Rinoa grimaced, speaking again. She felt suddenly very naked as she was. Unarmed.
"Let's just try to sneak by it,"
Squall said slowly. He knew better than to think that would work. He was already reaching for his inventory.
"I don't have a weapon,"
she reminded him, touching the spot where her blaster should sit. Even if she had it, Edia had shattered her son. Squall's gunblade was out first. He strapped it onto his waist. Rinoa felt bad because she couldn't even help him fight the monster. But he wasn't done. The second thing he pulled out was her blaster. Rinoa blinked when he materialized it. He scooped it up and passed it back to her.
"Squall, I don't have my son anymore, remember?" "Yeah, I know. Your blaster instructor found out and brought one of his older models for you to borrow when you woke up until you could get a new one. He calls it the Cardinal. He says it flies a bit strangely, but it's better than being unarmed. He did that for me."
Rinoa breathed, reaching out for her blaster. It felt heavy, like it was indeed loaded. She fit the straps around her arm, getting it snug and tight, before clicking the release. The edge that unfolded from within was black and red. Short, long, and sharp. It almost looked like a little bird with its wings spread. Accounting for its name, she supposed.
"I owe him,"
she said, stroking it gently. It was amazing how much better that made her feel. Squall nodded and stood.
"All right. Let's go kill that thing."
Rinoa smiled and stood as well. Diablos was already coating the blade in poison. Adjusting himself for battle. He was tired, Rinoa knew. She hadn't been the only one fighting while she was unconscious. In fact, she was sure that without him, she wouldn't have lasted as long as she did. When they were safe, she promised him a nice long rest. For now. Squall and Rinoa moved down the thin steps. Squall was in front, one hand on his blade as he looked to the big hangar doors. If they could just make it to that. His boots hit the floor and the monster turned like a whip. That shrieking sound of shredding metal was its cry and the ugly thing was fast as it charged him, long claws reaching angrily. It was too fast. Squall wasn't preparing for just how quick that monster was going to move because he had judged it based on the awkward movement he had seen on the catwalk above. It looked too big to be able to move so fast. Long claws shot out and Squall barely got his blade up to prevent them from slicing into his chest. He crashed backwards into Rinoa, both of them falling onto the stairs. His body was heavy on top of hers and the fast monster was about to strike a second time. Rinoa, reaching awkwardly around Squall's body, hit the trigger on the blaster. The new Cardinal was a quick blade, but it had a smaller hit radius than her previous edges. If the monster hadn't been so close, she probably wouldn't have hit it at all. The tip of the Cardinal's wing hit one of the glassy pink eyes. It actually clinked upon meeting, like the eye was actually made from glass. The monster reared back, crying. Rinoa caught the Cardinal and blinked at the tiny chip of glass-like eye that clicked against the ground.
What they?
Rinoa frowned at the glittering pink piece. Squall wasn't thinking about it. Jumping off of her, he struck out, upward. The monster was ugly, its head was tiny, but its long neck made a prime target. Squall sliced through it with only a bit of resistance from the spine. The body crashed back. The head rolled away. The glassy pink eyes continued to stare up at the ceiling as Rinoa lifted herself from the steps.
Nice,
she smiled at him. Squall nodded, sheathing his blade. He reached a hand out for her and helped her to her feet. Rinoa dusted off her clothing, returning the edge to the blaster.
All right, let's get to the cockpit.
Squall looked at the two doors down here. A small one, and the large hangar door. If he knew vehicles, the hangar would lead to the deck at the bottom of the ship. But the cockpit would be at the top.
Let's go back upstairs. I saw a door at the end of the catwalk.
Rinoa nodded and turned back to the stairs. She led the way back up. The stairs were short, a little taller than she was used to. So her eyes were down on the steps to make sure she didn't trip and fall. And so she didn't notice the next monster at the top until it shrieked it. Rinoa jumped at the cry, nearly falling off the top step. The monster up here was smaller than the one below, and his skin was fiery, angry red. Its yellow eyes were still glassy, it was reaching for her as it rushed at them around the curve of the rail. Crying out, Rinoa dropped. She felt her hair stir from its long limb swiping across the air where her torso had just been. She was hitting the release on the edge before she came back up. Squall put his hand to the rail and vaulted up over her body. He caught the next blow on his punishment, twisting so the hand fell between the twin blades. He jerked down, slicing through the arm. Crying out, the monster swiped with its other hand, drawing back quickly. Rinoa lifted the Cardinal and shot quickly, correcting for the new blade. She was still only partially on target, but this time for the better. The Cardinal cut through the monster's neck, the front half. Blood rushed out as the monster collapsed onto its knees. Rinoa jumped back again the wall to avoid getting any blood on her clothes as the monster hit the ground. She let out a breath, grabbing her chest.
Oh, man! That scared me. You reacted well,
Squall praised, stepping over the monster to move towards the door.
You think?
Rinoa smiled, jumping over it to move after him. He nodded as he hit the release on the door. A light in the center flashed red. Squall frowned and hit it again. Another red flash.
It's locked,
Rinoa frowned.
I guess we gotta go the long way. There's a long way. Vehicles like this usually have secondary routes through the engine room. Which is where? Don't know. Let's go back down and try the small door. The big one goes to the deck.
Rinoa nodded and turned to jump back over the red monster. She grimaced as she looked at it. Those things were really ugly. They certainly didn't exist anywhere on Gaia. Where exactly had this ship been floating around? Going down the steps was easier than going up. Rinoa didn't need to keep her eyes on her feet as she led the way back. So this time, she was able to spot the monster before it spotted her. Gasping, she stopped dead in her tracks before dropping below the rail. Squall didn't see yet, but he dropped down automatically after seeing her do so.
"What is it?"
he asked, leaning up to get a look.
"Squall, it's that monster,"
Rinoa whispered, pointing.
"No."
Squall frowned at the purple monster stalking around the cargo bay. Where was the body of the last one?
"It's probably just a similar one. He must have eaten the last one." In under a minute,
Rinoa made a face, lifting herself up to look over the rail as well. The monster turned, walking back. It still didn't see them. But Rinoa gasped.
"Squall, it's I."
He frowned. He could still see the tiny chip Rinoa had nicked off on accident on the floor. And, if he looked at the monster's eye she had chipped, he could see a sparkling spot where that chip would go.
"That's impossible,"
he whispered.
"We beheaded it." Plan.
She looked at him, worried.
"We kill it again. Properly this time."
Squall grabbed the edge of the rail. Then jumped, vaulting himself over the side. Rinoa leapt to her feet, staring as he hit the ground, drawing his punishment. The monster turned at the sound of his landing and shrieked, charging again. Rinoa lifted her blaster and shot. The cardinal flew so weird. It turned as it approached, slicing up the monster's arm. The large slice was bleeding, but it didn't deter the monster. Squall was more prepared for its speed this time. As it came in, Squall lifted his gun blade. He caught it between the fingers and jumped forward, using his strength and the monster's speed to split the arm completely in half. He hit the body and sliced out. The torso separated from the legs, taking half of one arm with it. The monster's legs were twitching reflexively, but it didn't respond when Squall kicked it. Just for good measure, he beheaded it a second time and kicked the head away. He nodded then, satisfied that the monster was well and truly dead.
"All right,"
he said as Rinoa came back to his side.
"Let's check to see if the little door leads to the engine room."
Rinoa nodded and followed after him. Unlike the door upstairs, this one opened to his touch. The door swung open and the green monster on the other side grabbed Squall before either of them even saw him there. Rinoa screamed as the monster dragged him within. She chased after them, aiming her cardinal. Squall twisted in the monster's grasp, preventing the weird chest-slash-jaw thing from biting him only by using his feet to keep it at bay. Rinoa prayed, aimed, and shot the cardinal. Finally, it flew true. Once again slicing through the neck but actually succeeding in severing it from its body. As it collapsed down, Squall freed himself and jumped back. He flipped over in the air before landing on his feet. He looked up as the green monster twitched, dead. Squall let out a breath, straightening his jacket. He nodded his gratitude to Rinoa. Then he bent down, scooped up the head, and shoved it into one of the crew lockers lining the wall. This was a smaller, more personal storage area. There was no way of reaching the engine from here.
"Hangar it is,"
Squall nodded to Rinoa. She let out a breath as they moved back to the door. Both of them hesitated before hitting the switch to open the door. They shared a glance. Squall's hand tightened on his punishment. Rinoa nodded, her finger on the trigger of the blaster. The door opened and they stepped through. The purple monster just beyond turned with a shriek of rage and charged them down. The glittering of one pink eye told them that their earlier efforts had been completely in vain. They moved at the same time. Rinoa shot the cardinal. It sliced through the monster's neck. A second later, Squall hit it from below and cut through both legs. Crashing down to the ground, the monster hadn't even lasted a second. Not that it mattered. It was going to get back up again.
What is going on here?
Rinoa yelled, running her hand through her hair.
Do these things never die?
Squall walked around the downed monster. It looked dead. It acted dead. Blood was no longer flowing from its wounds, signifying that its heart had stopped. He touched it with his boot a couple times but, just like before, it didn't react at all. It looked, for all intents and purposes, dead. It made him wish for Zell so he could raise the thing to ash.
At least they're easy to kill,
he said, returning to her side.
Let's watch it a few minutes. See if we can figure out how it's repairing itself.
So they stood around, staring at the dead monster. Its blood started coagulating on the floor. It grew cold and ashen. Even though they gave it easily double, triple the time they had taken to kill the green and red monsters, it didn't even twitch. Squall frowned. Did it know it was being watched? It couldn't even see them. Its head had landed with its eyes facing into the floor and the far wall. And he couldn't believe he just had that thought.
Now what?
Rinoa asked when nothing continued to happen.
Let's just move on. We'll figure it out later.
Rinoa nodded as they moved to the hangar doors. They opened easily as well. Instead of leading directly into the hangar though, the doors opened on another, smaller side room. One guarded by a red monster that wasn't at all happy to see them. As they came in, it turned with a shriek and charged. Squall killed that one. Then encased its head in ice. Rinoa poisoned the body. Squall removed its limbs and bound them together with rope from his inventory. It was rather gory work, but they were both hoping that it would have some kind of effect. Only then did they take the second door in the room. This led out into the hangar, where another purple monster, without glittering to its eye confirming it was indeed a different monster, was waiting for them with a shriek. Rinoa groaned. Squall grabbed her hand.
Just run.
The two of them sprinted across the hangar. The monster chased after them but it was coming from the far side. Even with its great speed, it wasn't fast enough to catch them before they ran through the second door. The metal door sealed behind them and the monster hit against them rather loudly. Panting, the two were forced to stand close together. They had run into a small supply closet. It smelled like cleaning fluid and was a little dark.
Well, at least there's no monsters,
Squall said, making Rinoa laugh.
Look! There's an opening. And a ladder. I think this must be the engine room access.
She watched as he took hold of the ladder against one wall and pulled himself up. He stepped down into a hole far above the door, above the hangar. He called out for Rinoa to follow him. When she stepped off after him, the two found themselves in a long, narrow corridor. It was rather hot and loud. The engine room. Squall pointed to the far end where she could see a small door. Rinoa nodded and they started across the metal grate catwalk that took them on a tour through the engine that powered the ship. It looked a little old, but it was running well. All the way on the other side of the engine of the ship, Squall pressed the release on the door. They stepped from the heat back into the cool interior. A loud shrieking to their right made them jump. The large green monster here was standing on a lift on a raised dais. Its arms holding onto the rails, it was glaring at them but refusing to move from its spot. Squall moved around it cautiously, but the territorial monster made no attempt to chase them down. Rinoa killed this one. She took its head off completely, getting rather good at these shots now. Squall took the head and tossed it into the engine room. The monster's body collapsed down onto the platform. Squall frowned as he tried to look past the body to where the lift led. The monster's body was preventing them from accessing the area.
"I think that's the cockpit,"
he mumbled unhappily. Of course it would be. Rinoa looked across the room to a large door. It had a blinking red light. She moved over and experimentally pressed against the release. The door dinged happily and the red light turned green, telling her she had unlocked it. The doors separated and she found herself looking out onto the catwalk above the cargo bay. The red monster there shrieked and charged. Rinoa cried out and slammed her hand on the bottom to close the door again. They slammed shut and the monster crashed against the metal. She heard its claws scratching, but the doors wouldn't open for these monsters.
"Bad news, the red one is alive again,"
she said, looking back at Squall.
"I'm shocked,"
he grumbled sardonically.
"Now what?"
Squall frowned as he thought. He needed up there but couldn't get there so long as the monster's body was there. He couldn't take it anywhere though, there were monsters that wouldn't stay dead all over this ship.
"Let's take that door,"
he nodded to the one across the engine room entrance. Rinoa made a face but willingly followed him to it. They had their weapons at the ready as Squall opened the release on the door. The yellow monster within was almost waiting for them. It charged them down, nearly pushing them back out. Squall fell into Rinoa and deliberately let the monster take him so it wouldn't take her. Rinoa cried out for him, jumping up as the door shut behind him. She quickly hit the release and chased them in. Of course, Squall was doing just fine of his own. It had only been a few seconds, but by the time she was running back in, Squall already had the monster speared on multiple shards of ice. She let out a breath of relief as he released the magic and the monster collapsed down.
"Where are we now?"
she asked, looking around. This room had large windows and multiple seats. There was no pilot's console, but there was a terminal of some kind at the front. Rinoa stepped over the monster, moving towards the console. She flinched suddenly in pain, grabbing for her side. She looked down quickly but saw nothing. She hadn't even touched anything. Too late, she realized that wasn't her pain she was feeling. She looked over to see Squall pressing his hand to his side that was bleeding onto his white shirt. She gasped, rushing for him.
"It got you." "The claws nicked me,"
he shrugged it off. The monsters died easily, but they kept coming back to life. Squall couldn't brag the same and he only had a limited amount of energy. He hadn't slept properly since Rinoa had fallen into her coma and he hadn't slept at all since crossing with her across the tracks from FH and sleeping as Laguna was hardly restful. While he didn't know exactly how long he had been up, by this point he knew it had to have been longer than a full day. He was tiring, hungry, and he still had so much to do before he could rest. Rinoa frowned at his face as he waited for his cura spell to take effect. Slowly, she moved in close and put her hand over his. He felt more healing magic coming from her. She was hardly faring any better. She had been in a coma, yes, but it had hardly been anything like peaceful sleep. She had been fighting the entire time, even if her body had been serene. She was mentally, if not physically, exhausted. Which, during battle, could be just as bad.
"We need a plan,"
she said gently, pushing more magic into him. It didn't take much. The wound sealed close under her touch easily. He was right, it was mostly just a deep nick. It simply bled a lot, it hadn't hit anything vital.
"I don't know."
Squall shook his head. For the life of him, he couldn't make out any reason why these monsters kept coming back to life. He removed his hand, blood staining his fingers. But the pain in his side was gone. He thanked Rinoa softly before moving across the launch seats around them. Then to the terminal at the far end. He frowned at the flashing light. Curious, he moved closer. The panel came alive at his touch and announced immediately that there was a newly recorded message waiting to be listened to. The date of the recording was from 17 years ago. Just how old was this ship?
"What does it say?"
Rinoa asked, stepping up beside him. Wordlessly, Squall reached down and hit play. Static. Then the sounds of battle. A sealing door. A panting man.
"The monsters are still multiplying, but we think we've discovered a way of defeating them. They come in pairs. Mated pairs. If you kill one, then leave it alone, the other will come to heal it. Their healing magic is unreal. We completely destroyed the yellow one yesterday, it was fighting again in minutes. The only way to take them out is to kill the mates simultaneously. The mates share the same kernel ARGH."
Rinoa gasped at the 18-year-old shrieking of shredding metal that was the monster call. The man screamed in agony as the monster killed him. Squall hit the button, ending the playback as they heard the distinct and gut-churning crunch of the monster chewing on human flesh.
"The mates share the same kernel."
Rinoa turned to him, trying not to feel bad for a nearly 20-year-old death.
"The same color,"
Squall guessed easily, looking at the downed yellow monster.
"They're all in pairs." "So, when he says simultaneously, we have to kill them at the same time?" "Yeah. That means we have to split up."
Rinoa touched his arm, frowning. She desperately didn't like the idea of splitting up. She would have to be apart from him again. After so long lost, alone in the darkness, she didn't think she could handle that so soon. Squall grabbed her hand, holding it firmly.
"We have no choice."
He wasn't any happier about the idea. She could feel it in him. Rinoa nodded unhappily.
"Okay. Who do we start with?"
Squall frowned, thinking. Mentally moving backwards and considering where each monster was. Red. Purple. Green. Where was the second yellow? All right. Think. Plot a course.
"Okay,"
he nodded, moving to the door, her hands still clenched firmly in his.
"The green outside this door won't move from the lift, and I can outrun the purple in the hangar. So you go for the red on the catwalk, I'll go for the red off the hangar bay. Then go you back up and take out the purple in the hangar, while I take out the purple in the cargo hold,"
she added, smiling.
"Then the green. I'll take the one on the podium, you get the one in the locker room. That just leaves the yellow. But this is the only yellow we've seen. There aren't any more rooms, are there?" "We'll find him. Let's start with this. Ready?"
Rinoa took a deep breath. Her hand clenched around Squall's one more time. Then she nodded. She was as ready as she was likely to get. Squall opened the door and they walked out cautiously. Neither was particularly surprised to see the green monster shrieking at them from his proprietary hold on the lift. He apparently really liked that spot for some reason. Rinoa made her way to the door behind which she could still hear the red monster scratching angrily at the metal. Squall nodded to her once before running off to the engine room. As soon as he was out of sight, Rinoa immediately felt exposed and helpless. "Calm down," he whispered in her heart. "I'm still right here. They go down quick, we'll be back together again before anything happens." Even alone, the green monster wasn't willing to give up his precious perch to attack her. He was glaring angrily through vibrant yellow eyes though. Rinoa swallowed convulsively as she tried to track, mentally, about where Squall would be. "Get ready. I'm about to cross through the hangar." Rinoa turned and readied her hand over the button. "Now." The monster on the other side wasn't ready for the door to open. Rinoa had the element of surprise as she ran through, cardinal at the ready. The weapon sliced through its neck, sending it falling backwards. Rinoa let out a shuddered breath as the monster twitched. It took Squall only a second longer to deal with his monster. She felt him alerting her to its defeat even as she was looking over the rail to check where the purple one was. He was already glaring up at her, one eye sparkling, attracted to the sound of the red dying. He was too large to be able to climb the steps to reach her up here though. "Ready for the next one," Rinoa said mentally. Squall agreed. They both turned and ran at the same moment. Rinoa jumped on the rail and slid down, shooting her cardinal again. After 3 deaths, this monster was more prepared to deal with her. It knocked the cardinal clear out of the way, sending it spinning against the wall. Rinoa called it back, raising her hand.
"Blind."
The sticky black magic coated all 4 eyes. Roaring in anger, the monster started swiping ineffectually at the air. Rinoa felt Squall wondering how she was doing. She asked for another second as she ran to the side to catch the incoming cardinal. Turning, she shot again. The wings ripped through the jaw one way, then the neck on the return. The monster collapsed down. "The red in here is still dead," she heard Squall tell her. She looked over her shoulder. He would just be beyond that door then. "Green's next. We're halfway there." "Right." Rinoa ran for the storage room. Squall had further to go as he had to backtrack through the engine room. She waited patiently until he alerted her that he was ready. The monster they had beheaded, dismembered, poisoned, and put on ice was no worse for the wear. It turned angrily when the door swung open. There was a hole in one of the lockers where its mate had retrieved the head. The monster charged at her. The cardinal brought it down quickly. Above, Squall told her he was also finished. That just left the yellow and the mate they couldn't find. Rinoa stepped from the locker room, looking around. The purple was still dead and she released a sigh of relief. Honestly, she had been afraid it wouldn't work. So where was the yellow? They had been everywhere in this ship already. It wasn't like it was a massive vessel with a great deal of room. Frowning, Rinoa started back up the stairs. She looked over towards the crew cabin only because she was checking to see if the red was still dead. He was. And the door to the cabin was closed tightly. She frowned curiously. No way. It couldn't be. Rinoa walked forward. Squall told her he was ready to kill the one in the launch cabin. Rinoa frowned as she reached for the button to open the cabin. The yellow monster in there was turned away from her, sniffing at their discarded spacesuits. "Go!" Rinoa yelled. Squall obeyed immediately. The first yellow went down easily. Rinoa watched as its mate's head suddenly lift, its body tensing at the exact moment she felt Squall deliver the killing blow. Angry, it turned with a shriek. It was as surprised to see her standing there as she was. How had it even gotten in here in the first place? She didn't much care. Rinoa lifted her cardinal and took its head. Rolling away onto the bed, the monster collapsed down to the ground, still. There. The last one. Rinoa let out a breath of relief when she looked behind her to see the red was still down, then over the railing to spot the purple's body unmoving. They were all dead. The door across the catwalk opened and Squall came out, dragging the yellow's body behind him.
"What are you doing?"
Rinoa asked, frowning.
"Help me. I'm taking these to the airlock. I'm not taking any chances. We're going to throw them into space just to be sure."
Rinoa nodded and ran forward to pull on the red. The monsters were surprisingly lightweight. It only took a little effort for her to pull it into the crew cabin. She dropped its arm to pull the second yellow into the airlock first. Then the red and the first yellow. Working together, especially for the ones on the lower levels, Rinoa and Squall gathered all the dismembered limbs and heads and dragged them to the airlock. None of the monsters moved again as Squall stuffed the last purple inside. He had to throw the last arm up and shut the glass doors before it could fall back out. From this side, he opened the doors to the outside. The air hissed as all the oxygen was drained out of the room, then the hatch opened. Reaching out, Rinoa used Diablo's power to eject all the monster carcasses up and out. When the last claw cleared the hatch, Squall shut them all out. Rinoa let out a breath of relief as she smiled at him.
"Let's go. The cockpit is clear."
He jerked his head back. Rinoa happily fell in line behind him as they made their way back across the catwalk. The lift, now free of the possessive green monster, responded readily to their commands. The two of them stepped aboard and Squall hit the button to send them up. For some reason, Rinoa felt incredibly nervous as the lift moved upwards. As though she was scared about more monsters. Or that the cockpit would be gutted. Or something else equally horrible that would doom them to certain death. Rinoa's gasp of delight was accompanied by a surge of emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. Because the cockpit was in perfect condition. 4 seats, sleeping screens, a gentle flow of air all surrounded by the swirling stars. Laughing, Rinoa ran forward into the room, arms outstretched. They were here. They had made it. They could fly home. Fly home. Squall frowned at the 4 seats. He couldn't even tell which one was the pilot's seat. He could drive cars, trucks, boats, trains, and certain construction equipment, but spaceships were far out of his abilities. Not that he really had a choice. Grinning, Rinoa spotted something blinking on the far left screen in front of a chair. She tilted her head curiously. If she stayed quiet, she could almost hear something come through.
"Squall, I think it's trying to talk,"
she pointed to the screen. Frowning, he walked over to the panel. It only took him a few moments to find the volume and he raised it up with a twitch of his finger.
"This is Star Air Station."
Squall and Rinoa froze. The voice on the end of the line sounded bored. Monotone.
Ragnarok, do you read? Ragnarok, do you read?
The dutiful disinterest of someone told to page a 17-year-old ship despite everyone knowing that there was no way anyone would be aboard.
Is that a radio signal?
Rinoa looked at him, surprised. Squall shook his head.
It can't be.
Radio signals hadn't worked in 17 years.
This is Star Air Station. Ragnarok, do you copy?
Squall reached down and gently hit the mic button. The sound of feedback startled the man on the other end of the line into silence. Unsure of what else to say, Squall opened with,
"This ship is called the Ragnarok." Whoa!
Squall heard something like a chair being upended on the other end.
Is this really the Ragnarok? Seriously? In space? Yes.
Squall raised his eyebrow.
Holy Hein. J. Go get the doctor. No, now. It's important. Oh. Ragnarok, stay with me. You still with me? Where else would I be?
Behind him, Rinoa was chuckling silently into her hand.
Who are you? How are you on the Ragnarok right now? We're survivors of the lunar base. We were outside the base when it blew and we just happened upon this ship. Whoa, seriously? Do you know the odds of that? I've got a good idea. Look, I don't know how to operate this class of vehicle. Say what? I can't fly a spaceship. Oh.
Squall heard scrambling on the other end.
No. Wait. Hold on. I got this. Wait. Okay. I've got the specs for your class of ships. Okay. Here we go.
Squall rolled his eyes as the man mumbled to himself as he read.
All right. Great. You're one lucky guy, you know that? The Ragnarok and her sister ships were designed for prolonged flight with a large crew. Redundancies were put in place in case of accident so the ship could be operated by those with only minimal training. If you can put in the correct command codes, the ship can perform its automatic re-entry program. You won't have to fly it at all. It will take you down by itself.
Squall didn't realize how tense the uncertainty of their return had made him until he was assured that it was possible. All of that worry and stress suddenly lifted from his shoulders as he let out a long breath of relief. Behind him, Rinoa made a small sound of happiness, like a choking sort of cry. Her footsteps rushing towards him was the only warning Squall received before her body was slamming into his back. Her arms wrapped around him from behind and she squeezed him tightly with her head resting on his shoulder, nearly crying from relief. Squall reached up and put one hand over hers. They could go home.
We can make it back?
Squall asked softly.
Ragnarok. It's been 17 years. It's going to be great to have you home again. What do I do? It's really easy. Just enter your location into the atmospheric re-entry program and you'll be okay. The ship will automatically search for the nearest safe place to land and touchdown. You'll be just fine. I don't know our location though. Roger that. We can track you from here. I've already got you on screen, Ragnarok. This is going to be super simple. Alright, how do I enter the data? You really don't know how to fly, do you? No, it's okay. We got this. We'll take it step by step. Are you in the pilot seat? No. Which one is the pilot seat? There's 4, right? 2 forward, 2 back. Yes. Okay, sit in the right, forward seat.
Squall unwillingly separated from Rinoa. She smiled at him though as he moved to follow the instructions. She watched as he moved around and took his seat. She bit her lip as her arm crossed over her stomach to hold her elbow. They were going home.
Okay, I'm here. There should be a touch panel in front of you with the flight controls. If the controls are up, push the green button to send them under the panel. They're not up. Great, then that's one step done. You're already ready for autopilot. Turn on the panel and get ready to type in the following commands.
The screen lit up at his touch. Whoever had been here last had already pulled up the autopilot program. Probably in an attempt to save their own lives from the monsters below.
Ready,
Squall said.
First, the program code. Type, WJEIE/.
Squall's fingers were quick and deft over the keyboard. He could do at least that much.
Entered. Alright, now your position. Type, 2872/HDIEU. Entered. No errors. It's fine. No, seriously. Make sure there are no errors. You mess up your location and you can accidentally send yourself careening into a mountain on re-entry. The program can't see, it relies on known topographical maps in its memory banks. So make sure. It's fine,
Squall repeated firmly. He hit the entry button, inputting the data. The ship groaned and Squall heard the distant sound of the rockets coming to life. The mindless spinning around them stopped as the ship began orienting itself.
Alright. Next, I'm sure you'll be okay, but, just as a precaution, there's something you should do. Turn off the gravity generator. I don't really know how much fuel the ship has left or if the readout is even accurate after all this time. This should save you some fuel though. It should be right there on the panel.
Squall knew where it was, he had needed to find it to turn it on. He turned it off again and his body immediately felt that strange return of disorienting weightlessness.
Alright, done. Congratulations! You're home free, Ragnarok. And one more thing. From all of us at Ground Control, we wish you Godspeed.
Thanks, Squall said, wondering if the extra pageantry was necessary. He turned back in his seat to see Rinoa still standing in place. He pointed to the seat next to him and Rinoa nodded. She made to take a step forward. And immediately started floating up.
Wahey!
Laughing, she started turning circles in the air. She was really bad at floating. Squall turned in his seat, lifting himself up. He pushed off of the back with his foot. He was much better at this than she was. Like he had been doing it all his life, Squall caught her neatly in air. He grabbed hold of her back, under her knees and held her bridle style as his jump carried him forward to the far wall. He turned and jumped back, taking her with him. She reached out and took hold of the head of the seat next to him. He released her and pulled himself back down into the pilot seat. He put the seat belt on, locking it in front of his chest, to keep himself from flying off.
Sit,
Squall instructed when Rinoa continued to float there.
Put your seat belt on.
Her soft hand came around his chin, cupping his cheek. She used him as leverage to pull herself around and down. Not into her seat, but into his lap. Squall's hands came up automatically to take hold of her waist. He blinked as she leaned into his chest. She was smiling, emotions swimming in her eyes.
"We'll be home soon?"
she asked softly.
"Hopefully. Now get in your seat." "Just for a little while."
Her grip on him tightened. One arm around his neck, the other hand continuing to caress his cheek. The end of his scar. Her feet were sort of just floating, but her body was pressing as tight into him as she could manage. Squall stared as her eyes closed, her head leaning against his shoulder.
"Why are you holding on to me like this?"
he asked, his voice soft.
"You don't like this, Squall?"
Her head lifted up to look at him. He shrugged. His free hand came up from around her knees and touched her hand.
"Just different. Not really used to this. No one's ever held me like this before." "How about when you were little? Didn't you feel safe and secure being held by your parents?"
Her voice was sad. Squall shook his head.
"I can't remember anything about my parents, if I ever even met them. But Elone was there for me. Elone used to hold my hand. Made you feel safe and secure." "Sure."
Squall's face tightened at the memories. They weren't pleasant.
"But she left. She just disappeared. And I'm afraid."
Rinoa blinked, her eyes widening slightly at the admission.
"I'm afraid of having that feeling of comfort taken away again." "You were afraid of losing us?"
Her voice was breathy in wonder, her eyes swimming.
"Is that why you were always so mean? So distant?" "I've always been alone. And it was easier if I pushed everyone else away before they could leave. It hurt less that way." "Squall."
Her voice was filled with sadness as she rested her forehead against his. All those unreadable stares. All the harsh words. All the anger he would display whenever one of them dared get too close. He had been trying to protect his own heart.
"You missed out on all the good things in life. You've missed out on so much."
"Maybe," he conceded gently.
"Definitely,"
she corrected firmly, leaning back to get a better look at him. Her hand traced down his face, to his shoulder. His arm around her waist tightened just slightly to keep her in place, pushing her a little more firmly against his chest.
"I like it like this,"
she whispered softly.
"I've always liked being held. I liked to have my mom hold me, sing to me. I even liked it when my dad did it. You know, back when we got along." "I'm not your mom. Or your dad,"
he told her, irritated to his own surprise. He always hated it when she compared him to her father. Rinoa chuckled gently.
"Of course you're not. But now, Squall, you're the one who gives me the most comfort. Comfort and happiness. And annoyance and disappointment, too."
Laughing, she squeezed him tighter, leaning her head against his shoulder.
Whatever. Whatever.
She could feel his own irritation now. He really disliked it when people did that to him. It made her laugh again. And he loved the ringing, melodic sound of that.
Maybe if you don't want us to know what your answer is going to be, you should try actually talking to us.
Squall paused for a long moment. The ship had turned around completely and was facing back towards Gaia again. Squall could feel it powering forward, driving them towards the planet. Once they hit the atmosphere and were back under gravity's control, this weightlessness would end.
You should get back to your seat now,
he jerked his head to the side.
Just a little longer,
she begged, her arms tightened again. You'll be safer in your seat, he grumbled silently. He heard her laughing gently at his response. Are you telling me you would let me fall? Squall's hands tightened around her reflexively. Because of course he wouldn't. And he felt her laughter start up again, just a little stronger. They stayed like that another long moment. Rinoa was in no hurry to move. Squall didn't want to force her away even if it would be safer. He was starting to rather like being held himself.
We're gonna make it home, right? We can only hope. Back to garden. Back to our ordinary lives. Best odds we've had so far.
She said nothing for a long moment. Then,
when we get back, we won't be able to stay together anymore. Will we?
Squall's arms tightened again. They were getting closer to Gaia. Gravity and everything they had been putting off discussing was about to have them in their grasp again.
No one can predict the future. There are no guarantees. Those were your words, Rinoa. That's not what I meant.
She frowned as she pulled back from him slightly.
We'll figure out what to do once we get back. They'll all be angry at me.
Squall said nothing. He wasn't sure what to say. To his own displeasure, Rinoa finally detangled herself from him and pushed herself over. She perched delicately in her seat, frowning at the ground in front of her. Tears were starting to fall around her head as she thought about their future. The panel in front of Squall beeped again, alerting him that the radio signal was back.
This is Esthar Air Station. Ragnarok, please respond.
It wasn't the same guy from before. This voice sounded more official. More distant.
This is the Ragnarok,
Squall replied calmly.
We have some questions for you. We're collecting escape pods right now. We have a pretty good idea of what happened up there. I hear you are from Lunar Base, but not part of the crew. How many of you are there? Just 2.
He heard someone writing something on a personal touchpad.
Your names? I'm Commander Squall Leonhardt. I'm a seed from Balam Garden. All right. And the other? Rinoa heartily. Rinoa.
The surprised cry wasn't encouraging.
The sorceress. She's on the ship.
Rinoa's face was turned away from him. Her shoulders tight. Squall didn't need the confirmation through the radio. He already knew very well what Rinoa was. The clues were a little too obvious for him to miss. He had killed sorceress Edia, only reviving her afterward. And the rules of being a sorceress meant your powers moved to the nearest female after your death. Rinoa had been right there. Ultimecia had jumped from Edia into her. And now Rinoa's healing magic she had already used on him, was far too powerful to be anything normal people were capable of wielding. Their hearts were connected. A connection made deeper by the pure magic that Rinoa now held. It wasn't normal. He knew what she was. He had deliberately shut down any discussion about it in the beginning. Not because she wasn't ready to face the truth, but because he wasn't. Rinoa took in a staggered breath, slowly turning back to him. He knew. She knew he knew. They both had been refusing to admit it. Now she had to say it aloud. At least to him.
I've become a sorceress, she said softly. I won't be able to stay with you anymore, Squall. Respond, Ragnarok.
Rinoa's tears were falling fast now, her body curling up, her knees pulling into her chest.
I don't want the future. I don't want to go home. I want the present to stand still. I want to stay here with you and never go back. Respond, Ragnarok.
Squall was staring at her. But his expression wasn't blank like usual. There was a sort of burning there that blazed on her skin.
Respond, Ragnarok. Nobody will want to be around me anymore.
Rinoa looked at her hands almost like she didn't even recognize them.
Everyone fears sorceresses. I'm an enemy now. By the authority of Dr. Odin, the sorceress will be seized upon arrival. Be sure to follow the retrieval crew's instructions and no harm need come to anyone. I'm scared. I'm so scared. Commander Leonhardt, do you copy? Is the sorceress listening, too?
Squall slammed his hand down on the volume, cutting the man off. Casting them into tense silence that stretched on as the hull of the ship started burning. They were entering the atmosphere again.
I'm scared, Squall,
she looked at him helplessly.
I don't want to go back.
Squall ripped his seat belt off and grabbed for her. Rinoa fell into his arms, clutching his neck desperately as their heart-wrenching sobs were ripped from her throat. His arms tightened around her almost painfully, not nearly tight enough, as he looked forward towards home. A place that suddenly seemed far too close. I don't know what to do. This is just another crossroad in my life. But, for the first time, I don't know which way to go. I've come this far because I've fallen for you. Rinoa. Am I just supposed to let you go? The ground crew was on the scene before the re-entry program even had the ship touching down. They had surrounded the area and were ready for resistance. Commander Leonhardt was known now for the threatening manner he had treated anyone who dared get close to the sorceress. They were more than prepared for a fight. So when the stairs came down and the two of them slowly descended, holding hands but weapons put away, no one was really sure how to react. Squall and Rinoa stopped at the bottom of the steps and didn't really know what they were supposed to say. What to do? Her eyes were red and puffy. His heart was raw and screaming. The bond that joined them had never been more powerful, and their own pain was being magnified in the other. Finally, a woman and a man came forward bringing only 2 soldiers with them. Her expression was understanding and sad as she approached. The man's jaw was tight, less forgiving than she. The soldiers hung back just slightly.
"Sorceress Rinoa,"
she greeted, her voice gentle as she beheld the young girl.
"Hein's descendant. Come with us."
The man gestured to their vehicle.
"We must seal your power for the sake of the world."
She knew that. She nodded once. Squall's hand tightened on hers.
"Thank you for understanding,"
the woman nodded to both of them.
"We'll give you a minute to say your goodbyes. Tell us when you're ready."
She pulled on the man's robe sleeve, forcing him to step back and give them some privacy. As much as they could have, being surrounded by soldiers on all sides. Silence. Rinoa took a breath and turned back to Squall. He was staring at her already. His eyes dark and burning and pleading.
"I should tell you. Before I go. I was possessed up there in space. There was a sorceress inside me. Ultimecia, a sorceress from the future. She's trying to achieve something called time compression. She wants to merge the past, present, and future into one existence. She's the only one who would be able to exist in such a world. She, and no other. As long as I'm free, she'll keep trying to use me to accomplish her goals. We can't let that happen, right? She can only possess another sorceress. So if I'm, and if you can do the same to Adele, then she'll have no way to get back here. She won't be able to do what she needs to do. We'll have saved all of existence. That's the right thing, right? It's our responsibility as citizens of Gaia to do whatever we need to in order to protect the world."
He wasn't saying anything. He was continuing to stare, and Rinoa felt hot guilt filling her belly. After she had promised not to leave his side, even though she knew what leaving did to him, here she was about to do exactly that. Forever. There was no way she was coming back from this. There would be no chance meeting in the future.
"I should go?"
she whispered, her throat raw.
"Before anything bad happens."
Painfully, like she was ripping her own heart in two, Rinoa pulled her hand from his. She came forward and nodded to the 2 people. Her head held high. Like an empress, she spoke.
"I'm ready." "Very well," the woman nodded. "We're going to be taking you to the Sorceress Memorial for the sealing. It's a very quick process. Completely painless. It will be over before you know it. We understand and appreciate your sacrifice."
Rinoa nodded to them and stepped in front to lead them in the way that she did. Her back straight, her steps determined. So damn beautiful. Squall couldn't watch her walk away like that.
"Rinoa."
She turned to see him rushing at her.
"Don't go."
He shook his head, stopping in front of her. She smiled sadly, trying to hold back more tears that she thought she had cried out in the Ragnarok.
"Thank you, Squall,"
she whispered, her voice raw and pained.
"But I have to go."
He blinked at her. Like he didn't even understand the language she was speaking. Rinoa looked down and the gleam of her necklace caught her eye.
"Oh, I still have your ring."
She reached up to pull it off. To give it back like she promised.
"Keep it,"
he told her softly, firmly.
"You sure?"
Rinoa looked at him.
"You said it was your favorite." It's fine.
What did it matter if that hunk of metal was gone, when it was taking her with it? Rinoa clutched the ring tight as she nodded. She walked away. She forced him to watch her walk away. She looked back only once. Squall wasn't important to these people. The only thing they cared about was Rinoa. With the sorceress in hand, the soldiers all packed up. She had nearly an entire army as an escort as they drove away, leaving him alone at the base of the Ragnarok. This was what Rinoa decided. There was nothing Squall could do about it. Right? His body was numb. Uncertain what else to do, he turned and started back into the Ragnarok. Someone would have to come for the ship eventually. He supposed he would just wait. The hangar was bright as he walked through. The cargo bay echoing, empty. Up the steps and into the antechamber. He looked at the lift to the cockpit and found he couldn't go up there. The memory was too fresh. He moved instead to the crew launch room. 2 rows of seats. Beautiful views of the landscape in almost all directions. It was bright in here now. He walked to one of the chairs at random and sat down. Unsure what else to do with himself. Just staring at the floor as the old engine settled back in against gravity, a force that it hadn't felt in a long time. Despite that, Squall still felt like he was up in space. Drifting endlessly. Hopelessly. Running out of oxygen and completely disoriented. He didn't know how long he sat there. It didn't feel like very long. Quistis's footsteps were incredibly familiar to him. He had known them for a long time. Short but brisk. The door opened for her and Squall jumped to his feet. Thinking, for half a second, that maybe Rinoa.
I'm home,
Quistis quipped, laughing. Squall blinked in surprise.
How did you get here? Well, a lot of things happened. I was unconscious for a while after the escape pod touched down. They should really work on that landing. And when I came to, it was just me and Piet. What happened to Elone? Elone wasn't with us anymore. Not only that, there were signs of a struggle. When the Star rescue crew showed up, I asked about you. They told me about this ship and that you were safe, so I thought I'd come find you. I see.
Squall said, his voice distant.
You're one crazy man, Squall,
Quistis grinned, wrapping her arms around herself.
When you jumped into space, you weren't thinking about anything else, were you?
He nodded. He hadn't been. There was only one thing that important. Quistis sighed, touching her face dreamily.
I wonder if there's anyone who would do the same thing for me? Oh, well. So. Where's our princess that so drastically changed the ever-cautious Squall?
Quistis was looking around expectantly, her face happy. Of course she was happy. Despite all the odds, Squall and Rinoa had made it back to Gaia. But now Rinoa was. For the second time, the door opened and Zell, Irvine, and Selfie rushed inside. All 3 of them were beaming at him. Quistis laughed in delight. Because they were all back together. Almost all.
Nice ship.
Selfie laughed.
Does it fly? How does it move? I don't know,
Squall shrugged.
Up, Squall.
Zell came forward, waving.
So glad you're safe. I know you're probably tired, so I hate to tell you this now, but we've got major problems down here. Well, here goes.
Zell stood at attention as he gave his report.
Some big thing called the lunatic Pandora came up out of nowhere like immediately after you left. Matron couldn't go through with her plans because of it. Which is okay anyway. Turns out, Matron's not a sorceress anymore. Matron gave away her power to someone without realizing it.
To Rinoa.
Turns out, the succession rule applies even if you're revived immediately after you die, who knew? So she asked one of the Esthar guys to drive her back home. Said she needed to think. And, oh, yeah. The Galbadian military is controlling that lunatic Pandora thing. Talked to Odin about it, and that was a hassle, let me tell you. Probably better it was me than you might have killed him. He's one of those guys who talks a lot, but slowly, you know? Worst combo. Right. So, the Galbadians excavated the Pandora from the ocean where Esthar sank it years ago. Inside of the Pandora, there's this thing called a crystal pillar. It has this unbelievable power to call monsters down from the moon. Honestly, I didn't think it would actually do it. Until it did. Been total chaos down here since that lunar cry thing. We've been hunting monsters in Esthar for hours. Kinda tired. Also, we're billing the city for this work. We were kind of asked to do it, we didn't volunteer. So, remind me to talk to Sue about that. Oh, and it wasn't just monsters that came down from the moon. Sorceress Adele, who knew that Nutjob was still alive, came down along with the machine that sealed her. I guess the stream of monsters caught her. Then, the lunatic Pandora caught Adele from the stream. Snatched her right out of the air. Dr. Odin thinks that may have been Galbadia's true intent, meaning. Zell. That's enough for now.
Squall cut him off, his voice low and flat. The others shared a look, surprised.
But, Squall. I know.
Squall shook his head, turning from them.
I know we've got problems. But I can't think right now.
Quistis frowned at the others, then at him.
What's wrong?
Squall let out a long breath. They deserved to know.
Rinoa is a sorceress now. She received Matron's powers. An escort from Esthar came to pick her up just before you all got here. Rinoa's in Esthar now.
Selphie gasped.
We have to go save her.
She turned on her heel and sprinted from the room.
Was she taken by force?
Quistis asked, concerned.
No. It was Rinoa's own decision.
Irvine's eyebrow raised as Quistis and Zell shared a look.
She was scared about being a sorceress. Scared of being feared. Hated. Scared that no one would want to be around her anymore. She said she couldn't handle that.
Irvine turned and walked from the room after Selphie.
Didn't you try to stop her, Squall?
Quistis gaped at him.
It was Rinoa's decision. What right do I have to object? Oh. Stop that.
She snapped at him.
What are you talking about? Why did you go all the way out into space to save Rinoa? So you could hand her over to Esthar? So that you might never see her again? No, right. Wasn't it because you wanted to be with Rinoa? You're a fool. Seriously?
Zell frowned at him. He looked surprised at Squall's unpassionate response. It seemed so different from the man who had crossed an ocean on foot to save Rinoa. A fool? Was that what he was?
Maybe.
Squall frowned. He felt like he was being ripped in half. Duty, Seed is trained to defeat the sorceress. Rinoa is the sorceress. He should be thankful that she was being sealed and he wasn't being forced to fight her. For the good of the world, for all of time and space, she was being put away. Their hearts were connected. She was the only thing he had ever wanted. The only one who knew when he was making jokes and laughed. Who kept coming back even when he pushed her away. She smiled at him, warming his heart. Her brown eyes sparkled in a face that constantly dominated his thoughts. He was a seed. He had responsibilities. Duties to fulfill. He couldn't ask his garden to fight then double-cross that now. He was her seed. He had given his word to protect her. He strived for her happiness. He couldn't betray her by letting her be sealed in the dark and cold forever. He may never get to hear her voice again. A voice that he had been lost and desperate to hear for the days she had been in a coma. Back when he had been hoping for a way to save her. Now he was handing her off, certain he'd never hear it again. What the hell was he doing? How the hell was this right? What could he possibly do? Of course. Squall's fists closed. His eyes cleared. His back straightened as his head came up. Quistis and Zell smiled at him.
Have you decided?
She asked.
Heading back to Esthar, right?
Zell pointed over his shoulder. Squall's heart hardened around his choice. He was cutting off a lot right now, but he knew what he could live without. And what he couldn't.
Pandora whatever and Sorceress Adele are out of my hands. I don't even know where to look for Sis. The only thing I know is Rinoa. The only thing I want for sure right now is Rinoa. We're going to get Rinoa back.
The Ragnarok suddenly roared to life. Quistis and Zell called out in surprise as it jerked and began rising. Squall turned quickly and watched the land fall away. The sky becoming brighter. Clouds zooming past them.
Hey!
Zell frowned as the ship rushed forward.
Excuse me, we're flying.
Quistis blinked. Zell groaned.
I really hope I'm wrong, but I can just picture Selfie in the pilot seat. Screaming woo, we're flying.
And a very excited Irvine next to her, Squall finished mentally. Squall turned and jogged back out the room and up the lift. Selfie had found the pilot seat no problem. She had also figured out how to pull the controls out from under the screen, disabling the autopilot and setting it to manual control. She was laughing hysterically as the lift stopped on the bridge. Irvine was howling in victory next to her, his hand on the headrest.
Hoo-hoo! We're flying!
Selfie yelled, her feet bouncing excitedly on the ground. Irvine turned and grinned to them, his face one of a man falling deeply in dreamy love.
Selfie's just amazing.
Squall frowned, walking forward.
You sure you can fly this thing?
Selfie shrugged carelessly.
I don't know. It just kinda took off. It's pretty easy, actually. I think it'll be fine. But there's no guarantee we won't crash.
She laughed loudly, filled with the thrill of speed and power. Her words didn't fill Squall with dread. At this moment, he didn't really care. After all, there were no guarantees about the future.
Selfie, head for Esdar. She's being taken to the Sorceress Memorial. We're going to rescue Rinoa. That's what I'm talking about. Hang on, girls. I just found a button labeled Turbo and I can't wait to find out what it does.
And the afterburners took Zell, Irvine, and Quistis clear off their feet. End of chapter.